Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Working Group 17. My name is Brenda Corona. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, we welcome you to today's Working Group session number 617, and we will be covering a few housekeeping reminders as this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. During this collaborative working group, we will cover the agenda and also cover our goals for today and also what we have posted yesterday. We encourage a lot of comments. We do have our technical assistants here with event producer Silas if you have any questions, but we will be sending out an attendance list in about 15 minutes. So you can click on that link. If you can't download that link, some people were able to copy that link to a different browser, so double check on that. Sometimes the firewall does come up for those who are trying to look at the attendance list. The next is that we do have the opportunity to ask a question by using the raise hand icon located on the lower toolbar. Here will allow us to know who's on queue. Either Juan or Silas will help call on you during the call. Make sure you state your full name and affiliation. Even though if you do go more than once throughout the call, please state your full name and affiliation to help us know who's speaking. And then today's agenda will have Juan cover today's goals, and then he will pass it on to Sylvie for the feasibility analysis ISO recommendation of phase solution development. So that'll take most of the majority of the time for today's call. And then at the end, about 11:30, we'll do an open discussion for stakeholder feedback on the solution to trade-offs with Juan, and then we'll just wrap it up with next steps with myself. The next slide will kind of cover where we're at. We have moved along with our proposal development phase. Right now, we have posted a draft proposal template with feasibility assessment, and that was just posted yesterday afternoon. I did send out a targeted email. Feel free to visit that. And those who have expressed that haven't been on that targeted email, make sure you do include your WebEx during the WebEx or email so we can capture that during any targeted email outreach. But at this time, I'll go ahead and introduce Juan, who will be our facilitator for today's call, and then I'll be here to take notes. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Brenda. And, I think everybody's ready to, if we could move on to the next slide, I think everybody's ready to really kind of dive into the meat of it, but want to frame up what today's discussion and what the goals are for today's discussion. I do want to acknowledge a couple of things. I want to reiterate what Brenda just said on the targeted emails. We're blazing a new path here in the sense of having an issue, have an off-ramp towards policy development coming from working group discussions. So I appreciate the engagement from our stakeholders here. I appreciate, the robust comments that we got. I know these are very fast turnaround times, but we are trying to very expeditiously resolve this. So again, reiterating what Brenda said, we will have a slide here where Sylvie, our policy developer for this effort, is going to kind of go through a tentative timeline. You'll notice it's very aggressive timelines. We want feedback in between each of those steps. So if you are not on those targeted emails, number one, please be sure to register with your email address when you register for the sessions. But number two, also feel free to reach out to stakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com, and we can make sure that we get that. We're trying to be very, very communicative about when we have the next set of materials or comments out, because again, we're hearing that urgency, and we're trying to move very quickly here. So I want to say thank you to the stakeholder community, and frankly also thank you to our policy team. There's been a lot of work that's gone on, and we're doing it in a very compressed time frame. So we appreciate you guys very much. So for today's working group session, we're going to present the feasibility assessment and straw proposal for the bidding above soft offer cap rules for bidding above soft offer cap rather. We will have that feasibility assessment. We'll be able to answer any questions on our proposed phased solution development. And then part of that is going to be, discussing a little bit further with you, the stakeholder community, some of the trade-offs in the approaches that we're proposing to move forward with, and that's in response to the comments that we received from you guys on that issue paper and stakeholder recommendation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give the floor here to our senior policy developer, Sylvie Spiewak. Sylvie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to rules for bidding above the soft offer cap, the feasibility assessment, and straw proposal. Some of you may be wondering, did I miss a straw proposal paper? You did not. This might be the first ever straw proposal PowerPoint. We wanted to get everyone's feedback as soon as possible, and we didn't think it was necessary to make you wait a couple of days while we put that together. So here we are in this expedited process with our straw proposal PowerPoint. Go to the next slide. Agenda for today. We are going to start by looking at some stakeholder feedback on the issue paper, which we published a couple of weeks ago. We are not going to spend time going over the contents of the issue paper, although that paper contained a lot of expanded background that internally we thought was incredibly useful for our assessment. So I've put that into the appendix just in case we need to hop down to it in order to contextualize the policy assessment once we get there. We'll primarily just focus on the stakeholder feedback that we heard and how we'll be addressing it. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what went into the feasibility assessment. I want to make sure that stakeholders are all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. When it comes to feasibility, it's really about your tolerance for trade-offs and risks. So I'll explain what the ISO has been doing for the past few weeks and make sure that stakeholders know how to provide feedback or argue with me on some of the finer points. Then we'll go into the feasibility assessment. We've got an appendix that has tons of analysis in it that we'll want stakeholders to look through and provide feedback on, and then look at a timeline for next steps. Next slide. Governance classification. This has been classified as EIM governing body, joint authority with the Board of Governors. This is here for your reference, and you are welcome to provide feedback on this. Next slide. All right, so this is less a proposal of what we're going to do and more a proposal for when we're going to do it. The feasibility assessment looked at all of the stakeholder proposals. We haven't taken anything off the table. Sometimes I like to make the joke that all costs can be variable costs if you just give them enough time. So this is sort of the same case where all of these proposals can become solutions if we had enough time to really think through them. So the ones that we'll end up focusing on today are the ones that we see as the least amount of risk in getting toward our summer implementation goal. I'll do a high-level review of the rest just so that everyone has that transparency around how we made those choices and provide the opportunity for you to tell us whether we got everything right or wrong. And for the proposals that we heard from stakeholders that we see are too great a risk to try and get done by August 1st, those are things that we can continue to talk about for the remainder of 2024 or put into the bucket of a more comprehensive policy development process. Next slide. All right, stakeholder feedback. Next slide. These are the two problem statements that we highlighted in the issue paper in response to or as captured by the stakeholder comments and the working groups up until we published the issue paper. They look very similar, but the main difference is the top one specifies that resources aren't able to reflect a bid high enough to preserve their state of charge and their limited energy. The second problem statement really reflects the rinse down version, which is something that we heard in a prior working group. Stakeholders said, well, our priority is we need to be able to hold our day ahead schedules in real time. So we offered an explanation of some potential solutions in the issue paper that are meant to do that, but are not meant to help scheduling coordinators reflect a higher bid. And what we heard from stakeholders is that that's not necessarily what we were talking about. Perhaps problem statement 2 is more a symptom of the problem, but not the problem itself. Next slide. And these are the 3 approaches that I hope you all are familiar with at this point. And I will continue to use this categorization throughout the presentation today and probably going forth Approach 1 is a group of proposals that would allow resources to bid up to some predetermined cap by modifying the bid cap logic directly. One of those proposals is to eliminate the $1,000 cap on DEBs. And then we have a group of proposals that look at modifying the bid cap logic so that resources with opportunity cost-based bids can bid up to, for example, the max import bid price or $2,000. Approach 2 is a bucket of proposals around leveraging existing tools to hold day-ahead schedules in real time and prevent reliability issues. Tools that were listed in the issue paper are the end-of-hour state of charge tool, self-scheduling, and we wanted to throw base scheduling in there just in response to stakeholder feedback asking how any of this might be applicable to EIM entities. And what we heard from stakeholders is that this doesn't address the problem. So we can really see this as a backstop for reliability, but not necessarily the thing that we're going to focus on developing today. And I do want to note that these things are existing. They do not require implementation. There's no implementation risk, and therefore they were not part of our implementation risk assessment. Approach 3, under the umbrella of this approach are proposals related to the reference level change request process. This includes modification to DEB calculations and modifications to the reasonableness threshold that allows for DEB adjustments. Next slide. Oh, yes?
So we do have a hand up. So let's go ahead and unmute Don. Don, go ahead.
Hi, Sylvia. It's Don Trethway from CISA. Thanks for the presentation. If we can go back to the previous slide, I just had some clarifying questions, and I think some numerical examples might help people understand the differences between approach 1 and approach 2. All right. So today, the day ahead, the real-time DEB for a storage resource could be calculated and could be $1,000.50, but it's capped at the 1,000. So you're basically saying now we can go to 1,050, and then if you allow the bids to go to let's say 1,300, the resource could bid to 1,300, but it would be mitigated to 1,050 in the event that local power market mitigation was triggered. Is that correct?
Yeah, if the DEB is, are we talking about approach 1 and 3, not approach 2?
No, yeah, just 1 and 3. I want to
Okay.
be really clear on what the distinction is between the two.
Well, do you mind if we maybe take a pause on that question, because the rest of the presentation is focused on that. We have a couple more slides just to review the stakeholder comments, and then we will spend the entire rest of this presentation talking about the differences between approaches 1 and 3.
Yeah, no, I think that's first, Don. Appreciate
Is that okay, Don?
that, but we're going to have that deep dive. And I think after we go through approach 3 and then approach 1, if there's anything that still remains there, more than happy to take up that tail end of this 3-hour meeting to kind of discuss further. Does that sound fair?
I'm happy to wait. I didn't think I was going into any big detail. I was trying to, I think if I read the stakeholder comments that came in on this, I think there is some confusion about what's different between 1 and 3. And I was just trying to see high level if I knew what the difference was, not to get into any of the specifics.
How about I give it a shot here? I hear what you're saying. We need a high level thing before we dive into the details. So approach 1 would not modify any of the DEB calculations beyond what they are today, which means if we raise the bid cap to $2,000 and your DEB only goes up to $800, you might be able to bid up to $2,000, but you'd be mitigated down, if mitigated, to your DEB, which is $800. Approach 3 is an approach in which we think about how to modify those the DEBs themselves. So the DEB could reflect something perhaps higher, in which case, if mitigated for market power, you would be mitigated to a value as determined through a stakeholder process that reflects perhaps more accurately, the opportunity costs that go above $1,000.
Right. So then my very simple example, an approach one, if the DEB was at 1,050 and the maximum import bid price is what we all determined was the right thing to do, that was 1,300. Then you could bid to 1,300, you'd be mitigated to 1,050. If in approach three, we decided that if mitigated, and in approach three, we just determined that it was $1,300 was the correct calculation for the reference level adjustment. You could bid to 1,300, and that would be your DEB as well in the event of mitigation.
Yes. That's how it. That's a simple version. Yes. We're going to talk about a few different variations on that within both approaches 1 and 3 that might change the way that the difference between those two examples looks.
So, well, thanks for letting me have the time to do that, because I think it's important for people. That's a very baseline concept that people need to understand.
Yeah, hold on to that example
for later.
Yeah, hold on to that example and jump in later once we get down to the comparison of approaches 1 and 3. All right, next slide. We heard that stakeholders largely support an in-market solution for summer 2024. Many stakeholders support an interim solution that we just described that would modify the logic used to cap bids. So today, DEBs are capped by the $1,000 soft offer cap. So one option is to remove that cap. Today, bids are capped by the higher of $1,000 and the DEB. So we would consider modifying that logic to say you are capped by the higher of $1,000 the DEB and the max import bid price. Most stakeholders also support a more robust policy process to consider enhancements to the process that the ISO built for resource-specific cost verification that's consistent with FERC Order Number 831. But many of you have acknowledged that this approach may not yield an immediate solution. So we'll talk about those sources of complexity and what we might be able to do for the summer and what we might have to save for later. Next slide. There are some stakeholders that do not support an interim solution for modifying the bid cap, and I want to highlight that because what we'll need to do with as a stakeholder community, it's important to minimize the risks associated with going through an accelerated process. So we want to be cognizant of the stakeholders who observe that this approach does not demonstrate cost verification and may not be consistent with FERC Order Number 831. I also wanted to note that the CPUC Public Advocate's Office is concerned that stakeholder proposals might conflate opportunity cost-based supply with emergency capacity. We do want to pay attention to our regulators. I didn't see anything from regulators across the region, but we do encourage other regulators to let us know if we're on the right track. Some stakeholders do support the idea of an interim solution, but have highlighted trade-offs associated with those proposals. For example, they see potentially high regulatory risk without demonstrating cost verification. Some of them have noted that it does not solve the root problem unless we're able to modify those DEBs in case of market power mitigation. And stakeholders have noted that some of these modifications could create unpredictable outcomes, a lack of transparency, and volatility similar to the current design. So today we're going to tease all of these things out to make sure that we address all of these stakeholder concerns and have the opportunity to assess these risks, to assess these trade-offs and minimize the risks involved with these proposals. Next slide. Stakeholders have made it clear that this is a priority and have asked for an assessment and an expected timeline. So we have been urged to provide a feasibility assessment, including a development timeline for stakeholder recommended proposal, which is what we will give to you today. We have also been asked to assess the level of risk associated with FERC review and an outline of how we think it's best to approach going to FERC and getting this approved. Some stakeholders have asked for an expedited FERC review process in order to ensure implementation by July 1st. So this presentation is going to go through each of the stakeholder proposals and define the risks that might get in the way of implementation in terms of policy, regulatory, which is FERC-related risk, and implementation risk. We did go to our management to see if an expedited FERC review was appropriate, and we've determined that it would not be appropriate at this time, overall, the binding constraint here is really the technology implementation. So even if FERC said yes tomorrow, we still believe that August 1st is the soonest that we could do the technology lifts associated with these proposals. Next slide.
Sylvie, sorry, maybe before we dive into the feasibility assessment, we did have a hand go up here. So this might be a good stopping point. So let's go ahead and unmute Callie, please.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Thank you for putting this presentation together on such a short turnaround time frame. I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more on that last comment, because we were one that asked for an expedited FERC order specifically when the CAISO filed to ask for a shortened comment period and then an expedited order. Can you elaborate a little bit more on why the CAISO feels that that's not appropriate, technology constraints aside?
Sure. There are still trade-offs and details to be ironed out, and we see a lot of risk in going to FERC with an issue that at this point is still somewhat contentious. So we believe that we need to take a little bit more time to talk over with stakeholders and make sure that we have strong alignment over what the next steps are going to look like.
Okay, I guess, but all of those details will have to be worked out, at least the stuff that needs to be in the tariff, by the May filing date, which regardless, it sounds like that's the target filing date, which I completely agree with. Immediately after, assuming board approval, we file at FERC. So you'll have to have the tariff level details already worked out. So again, I guess I'm not quite following the logic as to why the CAISO doesn't feel it's appropriate to then say, FERC, we're trying to get this in place before summer. We've had a lot of issues in the past, reliability issues. Can you please ask for, a shortened comment period and an expedited order so we can be in a better place for the summer, acknowledging that we're having more robust conversations to, get a long-term durable solution in for next summer. I guess I'm not quite following the logic as to why the CAISO feels that that's an inappropriate approach.
So I think the main reason that you just touched on is the reliability argument. We do have backstop tools in place to ensure that we can get through the summer without a reliability risk. So So when we go to FERC, that's not necessarily an argument that we can lean on for an expedited approval process. I do have a lawyer on the line if we want to get some more details on this.
Yeah, just real quick, just a quick reaction to that. I would think a reliability argument would actually go the other way. It would further justify getting something in place sooner, because obviously an in-market solution is better than out-of-market actions. But I mean, we don't, unless the lawyer wants to speak up at this point, I would just strongly encourage the CAISO to really consider asking for a shortened comment period in this case, so that we can better position ourselves going into the summer. And obviously the FERC can decide to go with that or not. That's a decision that they can make. But I don't see the risk with at least asking.
I'm happy to weigh in here. Yeah, sure. I mean, first, I think Sylvia provided the correct answer, which was that, we took this all the way to the top of management and got a firm no. So you're welcome to continue to lobby on this, but we feel like we have clear direction here. Ultimately, I think we're very dubious of our ability to meet the standard for an expedited order, but I'm happy to talk with you offline on that. Callie, as Sylvie noted, there isn't a per se reliability risk. We don't think this looks like the very, very few instances in the past, and there hasn't been any for several years, where we've asked for an expedited order. It is not something FERC takes lightly. It is an extremely high standard. We're not just talking about waiving the notice period or other issues. An expedited order have a much higher burden of proof and standard, and we don't think this meets it.
Okay, yeah, great. Happy to take this offline so I don't take up any more time here. But yeah, understanding the CAISO's perspective would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Callie. Yeah, let's go ahead and unmute Michelle, please.
From the Energy Division at the CPUC. We had put in some comments in the policy catalog indicating that we think that the hourly shaping factor for the maximum import bid price is not done correctly. And we also had indicated that we thought that the bilateral indices that are tied to the maximum import bid price are thinly traded. So giving you just one example, the number of 25 megawatt transactions on September 6th was 3, 75 megawatts. So that would establish the maximum import bid price. So I was wondering if we could get any feedback on whether CAISO, the time frame for CAISO looking at those two issues going into it. And then I have another comment after this.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for raising that concern up top. As we go through this presentation, one of the things that we want to think about with the stakeholder community is how well the max import bid price serves as an accurate proxy for these opportunity costs. So we do have an analysis section that shows you what that looks like. And Michelle, maybe you can jump in once we get down there to help us illustrate what you're talking about.
Okay, but the hourly shaping factor is slightly different. I think you guys do talk about it, but there is price separation between Palo Verde and CAISO, as well as CAISO and Mid-C, and that price separation does adversely affect the maximum import bid price. But I do have a couple of other questions I wanted to raise. Given that you had folks do comments, DMM put in sort of an alternate proposal, and just wondering whether, you have considered that as well. And then with regard to the reliability risk, I would note that, if some of these proposals are adopted, which basically has all of storage and all of hydro able to bid at $2,000, that's above the RDRR. And, these are RE resources that are supposed to be available, for stress system conditions, and that makes them less available than reliability demand response resources and potentially strategic reserve resources. So, I think I'm leaning the other way from Callie and wondering if this actually increases our reliability concerns for this coming summer. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. On that last point, I think you are not the only person that has submitted a comment of that type around the RDRR and what about the other resources that we're keeping at the top just for emergency or limited use. And I do have a note at some point in the middle of this presentation where we're going to talk about what metrics can accurately account for price separation. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Michelle. And it looks like we have one more, Sylvie, and we can dive into the feasibility assessment unless it triggers some other thoughts. Let's go ahead and unmute Dan, please.
Sylvie, this is Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Just recognizing some of the tension that's there in the balance of seeking an expedited order from FERC, and also, recognizing what we're about to go through in the feasibility assessment. I just kind of keyed in on whether the CAISO's assessment of there being reliability tools in place that can sort of achieve what we're trying to achieve with the in-market solutions, whether that assessment included looking at the tools available to the EIM VAs, and specifically those in the Pacific Northwest that are hydro dominant, which a handful of entities requested the expedited treatment, including Tacoma, Seattle, BPA, and a couple others. So just kind of curious if we can hone in a little bit on the reliability tools that are available for the EIM areas versus maybe what's within the CAISO's toolbox for managing the storage issues within your VA. Yeah,
so I wouldn't say that we're categorizing those tools as a way to supplant the other approaches that we're looking at today. And maybe this gets back to Callie's comment, where there's a difference between reliability and increasing the efficiency with which we achieve reliability. So these are distinct pathways towards getting to where we need to go. And I wanted to just highlight that approach too. Those things are in place as a backstop, but we certainly want to improve on the situation by making sure we can allow resources to accurately reflect their costs. We want to encourage bidding and economic bidding at the end of the day. So I think that maybe I only have one or two other slides on approach two, those tools that are currently in the market. So once we get through those, we can take stock and maybe schedule a very soon after this working group meeting to just focus on approach two. But I was under the impression that most stakeholders today wanted to hear about the proposals to modify the bid cap or the reference level change enhancement process.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely was not just advocating relying on approach two. It was more just focusing on the impact of the choices that entities have to make in the absence of having a higher bid cap, in how they're able to bid their resources into the market and ensure that they're able to control their storage/fuel to be available during the hours that they need it, and the impact that that has on reliability in either direction, either having to self-schedule those resources to sort of pull them from the market during periods when there's concern that they may be dispatched, in a way that the entities would not wish for them to be dispatched, or the potential that if they're left in the market for a certain reason, they may be short on fuel, short on the equivalent of state of charge during the time when those resources are most needed. And that does feel like it's a pressing concern for entities in the Northwest, and that is something that could drive the need for an expedited solution in light of what was experienced during the winter cold snap here back in January. And I personally am hoping we don't have a heat dome event in June, but you never know when that's going to show up in June, July, August. That could definitely drive a reason to want to get this in as soon as absolutely possible. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so we did mention on the slide that has the three approaches, base scheduling in parentheses for the EIM entities. EIM entities can base schedule their state of charge, can hold back whatever they need to from the market in order to control hydro in those schedules. And we didn't really hear a lot of feedback from stakeholders on that recommendation. So I think what you're driving toward is we need to talk more with stakeholders to make sure that those sorts of tools, while clunky and certainly not efficient, we want to make sure that they do the thing that they're supposed to do, which is be that reliability backstop. But I think we can continue that discussion separately from today. And we very, very much encourage that as well.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, Sylvie, no other questions in queue. Let's go ahead and dive in.
All right. Now for the exciting part. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so the feasibility assessment. I'm going to go through how each stakeholder proposal was assessed, provide a recommended timeline for development. What we really wanted to do is make sure that stakeholders have full transparency into the technology and policy trade-offs that we've identified in order to make a risk-informed decision about next steps. I really want to emphasize this is really about risks and trade-offs. There are some hard constraints that we can't violate, but there's also some room to say, well, I have a different risk tolerance from the ISO and we think we should go forward with this. So we want to make sure you have all the information you need to tell us what happens next. We also want to give you the full lay of the land, even of some of the proposals that we have identified as high risk and not feasible for summer, so we can take those lessons learned and start planning for the more permanent approach. Next slide. These are the three things that went into the feasibility assessment. Number one, stakeholder prioritization. We took what we heard from stakeholders being most important and made sure that those got high priority when we sat down to do our implementation and analysis. We thought through policy and analysis options. What are the impacts? What are the risks? What are the unintended consequences here? And we looked at how to implement them and what the technology impacts would be. And again, I'm ranking all of these in terms of risk. So something that is high risk means that there is a high risk of missing our implementation goal of August 1st. And keep in mind, like we have one shot at this. If we don't make it, we can't start over and try something again. So it's important to minimize this risk now. Next slide. This is the absurd timeline that we're looking at. Yesterday, we went to the Policy Review Committee, which is our internal management meeting where we make sure that we are fully aligned in terms of what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. And that's when we got confirmation that the three proposals that we're talking about today are things that, while still associated with risk, we can think about for August 1st. We're on a call this morning, and tomorrow, 24 hours later, we'll have the Market Surveillance Committee, and they'll be able to weigh in on the discussion. We'll try and get a draft final proposal out for you the following week. And the turnaround time for comments is going to be very quick, but we need to get everything prepared for the board to file at FERC and have implementation done by August 1st. So you see that there's very little wiggle room here to expedite this any further, but we are doing our best. Next slide. So, technology and implementation assessment. The first thing we did was sat down and mapped out how to implement each of the stakeholder proposals so we could identify some of the regulatory and implementation risks that might arise. In some cases, we actually actively explored multiple versions of stakeholder proposals so that we could give stakeholders the opportunity to assess different trade-offs. For instance, how we target implementing these changes at certain resources, or how we, or the specifics of how we modify the cap might change the balance of these trade-offs. I'll describe technology risk as either low, medium, high, or high. And here's how you should interpret that. High risk involves a lot of system integration or complex impacts, which means more stuff can go wrong as we are designing, building, and trying to implement these changes. And the risk that we discussed today, low, medium, or high, that should be interpreted as what the baseline level of risk is associated with these proposals. So it likely won't be lower risk than what we've described today, but things could come along that raise the risk of these proposals as we continue to talk. Next slide. Policy and analysis assessment. We ranked the proposals in an order to represent how significant a shift from today's policy these proposals represent. And that helps us benchmark what we expect the risk might be in terms of regulatory risk, i.e. FERC's acceptance of proposed changes. It's a lot less risky to go to FERC with a small incremental change than it is to go to FERC with a huge shift in policy that we haven't spent a year talking about. We also want to be cognizant of risks from observed impacts that may be associated with trade-offs or unintended consequences that we would usually spend a lot of time during a stakeholder process talking through. To that end, we have an analysis which is in the appendix of this presentation based on historical conditions to show how these proposals may have over or under or correctly estimated prices on days between 2021 and 2024 when conditions were triggered to raise the bid ceiling. And just a final note on this, while we might recognize some of these things as high policy risk today, strong stakeholder alignment can help us reduce that risk. But we do have limited time to assess trade-offs, so your feedback is super important as we go through this. Next slide. So these are the three approaches that were in the issue paper. I believe the next slide shows a high-level summary of what we're into. Next slide. Approach 1. This is changes to the DEB capping logic and the bid capping logic. The ISO believes that some variation of proposals under this umbrella may be feasible for August 1st, but there are things that we need you to consider today. For example, how to define and identify the resources that we will be applying these changes to, and we need to think through some of the trade-offs between policy and technology risk. As my exchange with Dan earlier may have highlighted, approach 2 is something that we won't be discussing today, but because there are no implementation changes required for the summer, but we do want to continue the discussion around these to make sure we identify any limitations that currently exist and enhancements to make sure that these tools are applicable to a broader scope of technology types and regional partners. Approach 3, this is the bucket of enhancements to the reference level change request process. We have determined that the risk of these changes is very high, and so have categorized these proposals as infeasible for August implementation. Next slide. So this is the one final slide that I haven't approached to, but again, we will be revisiting this at some point. I got some questions around the end of hour state of charge constraint tool and how that might work for hybrid or co-located resources. So I wanted to just plug this as a response to those stakeholders that asked. The ability to use the end of hour state of charge constraint may have impacts with storage resources aggregate capability constraints. Off-grid charging limits will not be relaxed for standalone use resources where that ACC constraint takes priority, but it will be relaxed if used as part of a sub-ACC when we give priority to the end of hour state of charge constraints. In general, we will be looking for stakeholder feedback on the end of hour state of charge constraint tool. It's new, so we understand that there's still some learning to do and some operational experience and assessment to be done. We also have this exceptional dispatch state of charge tool that has already been implemented as part of the energy storage enhancements. It should be an improvement from the tool that we had on September 6th, 2022. We're not going to talk about it anymore today, but it nonetheless provides this improved reliability backstop than we've had in the past. Ultimately, though, the ISO and stakeholders are fully in agreement that the best option is to develop enhancements that allow resources to more accurately and flexibly reflect opportunity costs in the market. So that is our goal today. Next slide. This is the final caveat before we get into the assessment. PDRs have been determined not within scope for summer 2022. PDR resources may have opportunity costs, and we understand that those costs are different or can be different than the temporal opportunity costs due to energy limitations, but we need to spend more time with the PDR community talking about it and thinking about it. The ISO believes that there is a significant policy discussion. Significant policy discussion will be required in order to define and vet these operating costs, and that's just not possible for this summer. But we look forward to continuing that discussion with stakeholders and the PDR community.
All right. Sylvie, we do have a hand up. Let's go ahead and unmute Callie.
Hi, Sylvia. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. I'll be pretty short on this. I really think the CAISO should reconsider not allowing PDR to be within scope for summer 2024. I think we all agree to meet this timeline, it is going to be an interim solution. Let's not make, the perfect be evil of good. And I think, PDR, I think it was the 2020 events, I can't remember which summer event, they were actually pretty vocal about how this harmed them not being able to bid above 1,000. They were all prematurely dispatched, and on those heat wave events where it's multiple days in a row, when it got to the hottest time of the day, when the market really needed to be there, they were exhausted. And that was because they couldn't bid above 1,000. In terms of the cost conversation, honestly, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think PDR, the underlying resources are a bunch of customers that are aggregated up. They can vary like the underlying resources can vary, but what the CAISO has visibility into doesn't go to that level. So in my mind, I think this is very similar to the logic used for the non-resource specific RA imports, and that the CAISO recognized we don't have visibility into the underlying resource characteristics that are supporting that energy. And because of that, we can't estimate those costs. And I think PDR has a very, very similar logic that can be applied there. So again, really encourage the CAISO to go back to this. I think if we don't, and we end up with another heat wave this summer, you're going to have the same situation where they're going to be dispatched before a lot of the other resources are, and then not available when the market actually needs them. So I will leave it at that, but again, really encourage you guys to go back to the drawing board on this one.
Yeah, Callie, I feel like you're trying to do my job for me. You've just highlighted many of the main points that make this topic complex. And that complexity is the reason why we have determined that this may not be something that we can achieve by August 1st. Again, we're happy to continue talking about these things. We'll be accepting comments on all of these decisions. But for the time being, all of the points that you just made are the reasons why we don't think we can come up with a perfect or an improvement on the status quo by August 1st. But we don't deny that there's a problem and would like to keep talking about it.
Yeah, I guess that's where we disagree. I think you guys do have a solution. It's the solution you guys applied to the non-resource specific RA imports, and the same logic used to justify their bidding rules under FERC Order 831 conditions apply to PDR. So again, I'll leave it at that, but I do think you guys actually have a solution in place today that can be applied to these resources.
I see Michelle Keto's hand.
Yeah, this is Michelle Keto from the Energy Division. So I just wanted to note that, I mean, we do keep talking about non-RA specific resources, but recall that the CPUC right now has a rule that the RA imports have to bid zero. So we really haven't tested this. It would just be non-jurisdictional RA imports. So we're talking about this methodology as if it's in place and working, but it has not been in place, and it cannot be judged to be working as of yet. The other point I'd make about PDR is that on most of the days where the maximum import bid price was in effect, it was actually at the cap. So if you look at the data in the appendices, the maximum import bid price is $2,000 because of the price separation and the shaping factors. So that essentially means that all PDR would be bidding $2,000. And again, I'd note that that's higher than RDRR. And that raises questions about whether what we're paying for resources that are potentially needed during stress system conditions. Now, I know that they don't want to be available more than 3 days, but a heat wave may be 5 days and they may be needed all those days. So I think these are important questions, but I'm not certain that it is appropriate for these resources to not be available during stress system conditions. Thanks.
Callie, do you want to do a quick response before? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, Michelle, I get that balance there with RDRR, and we kind of laid out an option, I think, in our comments that I think strikes that balance pretty well. But again, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Yep, Sylvie, nothing else in the queue? Go ahead.
Next slide. So I'm so glad, now I'm glad that Don jumped in when he did. I was going through this with my team yesterday, and they said, why are we starting with approach 1? And I said, the people need to understand the differences. So we're going to, approach 3. So we're going to start with approach 3, even though that we've assessed this as relatively higher risk for summer than approach 1. And we're doing this so that you can understand what the trade-offs and the differences are between these two approaches. What we've heard from stakeholders is that there's really, the important piece here is the DEB adjustments. We need to be able to adjust these DEBs in order to have a robust solution. We do believe that some variation of approach 1 can have the same effect as stakeholder preferred proposals. So we're gonna take a look at approach 3, lay the groundwork for what we think is ideal, and then look at approach 1 and see what we can do with those modifications. Don.
So one of the things when we were putting together our proposal that you've put into approach 3 was the comments made at the end of the March 12th meeting by CAISO that they wanted something that was already automated. And one of the features that I'm not sure works with approach one, but I might be wrong. But was that if a scheduling coordinator submitted a bid, they didn't need to know what the maximum bid price was going to be, or didn't need to know what it was. It would be automatically updated. And if they bid, they would just bid $2,000, and then it would automatically move their bid down to whatever the maximum they were allowed to bid. Is that functionality? Does that support approach one too, so that the SC doesn't need to know exactly what the bid cap is? They simply could bid 2,000 and it'll bring it down to that level.
Now I understand what you're asking. Yes. Okay. The term automation might be a little bit thorny because we use it in different ways. The automated reference level change request is considered automated, but you still have to take an action. You still have to go into Cyber and request an adjusted DEB. You can request an adjusted DEB up to $2,000 and it'll just give you the highest value of your reasonableness threshold. So in that way, you don't need to know what the max import bid price is. It'll automatically revise you there. And that's the same with approach one. If we set the bid cap to the max import bid price, you bid all the way up to $2,000, it'll automatically revise you down. So you don't necessarily need to know. I'm sure it would be helpful so that you can bid strategically and understand how to maximize your revenue in the market. But at the end of the day, we'll put you down to where you need to be.
Well, again, I don't think anyone's bidding strategically. I think they're bidding what their estimation of their marginal cost is. And to the extent that that comes in higher than what you're allowing for a bid, it would be nice for that to be automatically adjusted down versus requiring an additional action by the scheduling.
Thank you for correcting my language use there. And yes, I agree with you. So we'll talk about that when we look at those approaches. So
now this comes down to the only difference then, if that because I wasn't sure if that functionality to where the SC didn't need to know the act would apply to approach one. So now if it does, since it does, the only difference between 1 and 3 is whether or not there's a change to the DEB or not.
Yes. There are some other small differences. There's actually some significant technology differences, but let's get into that. Should we go to the next slide? All right. So this is approach 3.
We did have Michelle.
Yeah. Michelle.
I'm sorry, Sylvie. Yeah. Let's go ahead and unmute Michelle.
Sorry, just a clarifying question. Would the are we proposing that it would just be one level? So if we imagine that September 6th, the maximum import bid price was $2,000, would the opportunity cost be $2,000 for every hour of the day? And then if that brings you into the net peak hour, I don't understand how we can argue that we're having efficient dispatch if, 14,000 megawatts could bid at $2,000. I mean, how would CAISO determine which resources get dispatched? And also, if we're talking about the hour from 4 to 5 p.m., the opportunity cost is no longer $2,000, right? So if we're talking about intraday, the opportunity cost is gone because you don't need to hold your state of charge because there's not 4 hours left. So I'm really struggling with this. Thanks.
Yeah, I understand your questions. On the first about what value we're reflecting, so the max import bid prices you've illustrated is an hourly curve. There's actually some technology constraints here that have necessitated that we've modified some of these approaches a bit. So in some cases, we're reflecting an hourly curve in the solution, but in some cases, we're only choosing a single value. And I'll go into why as we keep going.
Right, but just on that, if you're reflecting the maximum import bid price on an hourly basis, then the noon to 4 p.m. maximum import bid prices are very low, so that wouldn't allow you to do opportunity costs. So the opportunity costs would be low during the time you want them to be high, and they would be too high in the times you want them to be low.
Yes, trade-offs.
Thanks.
We'll get there. We'll get there. Don't worry. Don, do you mind if we make a little bit more progress before jumping back into discussion again? I'm going to say yes.
I wanted to respond to Michelle.
Okay,
to help is the point she makes that, this is why I think the maximum import bid price is valuable, is that it does give the ability to shape that maximum bid cap throughout the day to address exactly the point there. And I think that's where, Michelle, if you go back and look at what CISA has been arguing for, we want to get these resources to the right portion of the bid stack. Not to, we don't, it shouldn't be, it doesn't need to be above PDRs, it doesn't need to be at $2,000. It can be shaped throughout the day. And if you put them at the right part of the bid stack, which is consistent with the non-resource specific or RA resources, even though I completely agree that that's never been tested, but at least that's a value that we could all sort of latch onto. At least in our at noon, the storage resources would be at a bid level that they wouldn't be dispatched unless to discharge unless they were absolutely needed in noon, which allows them to keep their state of charge for later in the day when the prices will be higher. So does that truly recognize the opportunity cost? It probably doesn't, but we would, if we wanted to try to capture the opportunity cost, I think we'd be debating for the next 5 years whether it should be $2,000, because there's a potential it could be. I think that's someone could make that principal position, or we can all say, let's just make sure that we don't discharge resources early because we arbitrarily put them too low in the bid stack because we didn't recognize that there is an opportunity cost that needs to be reflected somehow.
So what we're hearing right now is that there are some complications and some things that we need to elucidate better as we go through this presentation. Michelle, if you want to take a moment to respond, I can give you the floor. Otherwise, we'll keep moving. There we go, Michelle.
Sure, happy to respond. I totally understand that, but if all we're worried about is holding the state of charge, I think we have other mechanisms. My issue is that if the mechanism that you bid at 2,000 during the middle of the day is literally only to hold your state of charge, then it will do that. It will hold your state of charge, but it could, if you pull it into the net peak hour, it could have some adverse impacts. And so I think that's not what people are asking for. So if you look at WPTF's comments, for example, they say, well, if we're going to do this in real time, why don't we do it in day ahead? So, and then why don't we allow PDR, which isn't about holding the state of charge anymore? So I feel like a lot of people have different motivations. And so I think it's pretty clear that we have to figure out what we're trying to solve here. That's all. Thanks.
All right, Don, I think you're still unmuted. I saw Callie's hand go up. Oh, I saw Callie, your hand go back down. So, okay, do we want to go ahead and continue on? I think we're going to dive into some of the things being alluded to as far as complexities. Don, any response there? Okay.
Oh, am I still unmuted?
Oh.
I didn't realize.
You are.
Okay, very good.
All right.
All right,
we'll pause in this conversation.
Michelle. I think we're aligned with what the concerns that Michelle's outlined, and we're not asking to bid $2,000 all the time. We don't think that that's actually necessary. Although, like I said, someone could legitimately argue that it is the proper opportunity cost. We are simply saying that storage should be able to bid at a price level that it's only dispatched if it's needed because it's the last thing you can dispatch earlier in the day. And that way and unfortunately, if you had everybody self-schedule, you had everybody basically pull their availability away from the market, you're going to get price spikes in noon versus if system conditions change significantly. So it's more about just making sure that you position the resources where you want to determine how you dispatch them. Very similar to the RDRR approach. You do not want to dispatch RDRR until you're at the end of the bid stack. And so that's why they're stuck in the end of the bid stack. And we're doing something very similar here, or what we're proposing is to do something very similar here. It's about positioning resources in the right spot on the bid stack so that they're used optimally by the market and don't require out-of-market actions to do it.
Thanks, Don. I think that I would like to continue with the presentation so that we all have sufficient detail and empirics with which to inform what Dawn is saying and what Michelle is saying. So if we can pause this and recontinue it after going through these proposals, I think that'll help the discussion move along.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's do that. Let's get Callie's hand, and then from there, I think Sylvia brings up a good point. We're going to have a lot of context and the ability to kind of continue that discussion, but I think it'll be an informed discussion as we kind of continue on with this presentation. So Callie, let's go ahead, and then we'll toss it back to Sylvia.
All right, thank you. Yes, Callie Wells with WPTF. And actually, I appreciate this because there was something that I think Michelle and Dawn just both touched on that I didn't see in the slides, and maybe I missed it. So I was kind of hoping to bring it up here, and that's the day-ahead bidding. So I wasn't clear if CAISO is planning on applying whatever comes out of this effort to the day-ahead as well, because you do have the same conditions that show up in day-ahead. The bid cap can be increased in day-ahead, and to us, it makes sense if you're going to change the bidding rules for certain resources in real time, you should extend that logic to day ahead. And again, we're not saying bid up to 2,000 every hour. It's apply the same bidding rules as the other resources in both the day ahead and real time, just like everyone else has. So just be clear on that one. But yeah, and I wasn't sure if you guys if you have it in your mind in both the real time and day ahead, but we would appreciate that clarification.
That was one of the first things that we thought about when we started going through these proposals, the implications of day ahead versus real time, both versus neither. You're not the only stakeholder that's asked this question. So I'll be sure to touch on that point as we go through this.
Great, thank you.
No problem. All right, approach 3, enhancements to the reference level change request process. Many stakeholders support calculating DEBs based on the current operating hour, using the reference level change request process to adjust those DEBs using a resource-specific reasonable threshold. Some stakeholders have proposed specific formulas for calculating that reasonableness threshold, and let me take a second to remind everyone that your DEB is a number that's calculated pre-market. You can compare it to, if you request a DEB adjustment, it gets compared to this reasonableness threshold, and that would allow you to receive an adjusted DEB up to that value of the reasonableness threshold. So the recommendations on the screen is to allow resources to effectively adjust their DEBs up to the max of the max import bid price and highest cost verified bid for storage resources with an adjustment there for round trip efficiency, and for hydro resources to allow them to adjust their DEBs to a reasonableness threshold whose short run opportunity cost component is modified to reflect the max of the max import bid price and highest cost verified bid. Let's go to the next slide. So what I wanted to do is put these into context against what the most incremental changes from today's policy would look like and how this would effectively impact a resources-specific bid cap. So today, you have a DEB. If you go to make a DEB adjustment, your DEB is compared to a variable cost DEB. All resources reasonableness threshold is a variable cost DEB. And this is why some resources can't use the reference level change request process today. In fact, there's something in the tariff that says hydro resources cannot use the automated reference level change request process today. And this is because the variable cost DEB doesn't necessarily capture the costs of those resources. It's got a fuel component to it, and that is in the appendix if you want to take a look at that. So it's possible that today, if we allowed you to go in and request a DEB adjustment, that the reasonableness threshold would actually adjust your DEB down. So the first step to improving the reference level change request process would be perhaps to reflect a resource-specific DEB as the reasonableness threshold. And what that would allow you to do is go into the reference level change request process and request an adjusted DEB up to the value of your uncapped DEB. And that way, if you are mitigated for market power, the minimum that you would be mitigated down to is your uncapped DEB, or whatever you've requested your adjusted DEB to be. Option B is an incremental step on top of that. So I'll note that today, thermal generators or gas generators whose DEB is a variable cost DEB, when they go to make a DEB adjustment, there's a scaler on that variable cost DEB, which allows them to adjust their DEB above what the default is. So they can receive a modified DEB that is higher than the DEB is calculated to be pre-market. And that provides some headroom, which accounts for differences between actual and expected costs. If we go one step beyond that, we get into the territory that we're talking about today, where storage and hydro resources don't need to not only capture what's in their DEBs, but also potentially differences between what we expect the cost to be and what they end up being. So this is where the modifications to the reasonableness threshold that stakeholders have proposed come into play. But you'll note here that the effective bid cap on all of the previous ones are incremental above the DEB. Here, for the highest day-ahead marginal energy cost, or the max of the max import bid price, I say uncertain. And that's because, and we'll see this in the analysis, if you use a system-wide metric, it could be higher or lower than a storage or hydro resources DEB is, which means that we'd have the same problem that we do today, where if you go to make request an adjusted DEB, it's possible to be adjusted down instead of up by using these metrics. We did not get any feedback on approach or on option C here, even though we did propose it in the issue paper. And we did so because we heard stakeholders like Michelle Quito express concerns over the liquidity of the max import bid price, the accuracy of that metric to reflect opportunity costs. So we wanted to provide an alternative for stakeholders to consider as part of this process. I see Don's hand.
Hi, Sylvie. Can you explain how the two proposals on the previous slide, in terms of the reasonableness threshold, how that could ever result in a value lower than your DEB?
Today, it can't because we don't allow you to do it.
Okay.
But let's see. I have an example. Let me see what slide it's on.
I mean, are you saying that the day-ahead prices were higher than the real-time prices? I mean, from a DEB standpoint, I mean, I guess that could happen, but
so what you're asking is if we use the highest day-ahead MEC, why
no.
that might be
I'm
lower
saying
than
we were focused on real-time. I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
And you know, so I was always under the assumption that what we had proposed would always be just triggered during the $1,000. So I don't know how you could ever get to where your DEB was lower than the $1,000, or, you know, it's always going to be above it. So I don't know. I don't see how it can go down. So we can take it offline, but I don't see how that actually plays out.
Maybe ask me again and ask it in a different way. I'll try and explain it to you. But let's keep going and yeah.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure where the source of confusion is yet, but I'll figure it out and we'll get there. Or maybe one of my team members knows. Katie Wickler.
Hey, sorry, double mute there. Hey, Don, thanks for the question. So I think what Sylvie's getting at is that the reasonableness threshold DEB, as it's currently calculated, uses the variable cost-based formula. For non-gas resources, the way that gets calculated ends up being a value that's pretty low. The cost-based DEB includes things like the GMC, O&M costs, fuel costs if you happen to be a gas resource, but for the non-gas resources, that value is calculated to be pretty low, you know, GMC times a scalar. So
we were substituting that calculation with the formulas on the previous slide.
Right.
I mean, which I agree is an implementation issue, but I don't see how it could potentially give you lower prices than what you currently are doing today.
Yeah. I think the best way to answer that will be to look at the analysis and show you when and how that occurs. Because it's a little bit more difficult to describe with the max import bid price. You might need to see the graphs to understand. With the highest day ahead MEC, it's a little bit easier. Storage DEBs, the opportunity cost embedded in the storage DEB is nodal specific. It's based on your LMP, which means it accounts for stuff like congestion. The highest day ahead MEC does not. So it is possible that the LMP used to inform the storage DEB is higher or lower than the day ahead MEC. And the way that the reasonableness threshold works is that it doesn't, it validates the submission that you put into it. So if you say, I want a DEB that's X value, and that is higher than the reasonableness threshold, it just gives you what the reasonableness threshold is, which in some cases could be lower than the DEB. I saw Alva's hand pop up and then go back down. Did you want to jump in, or? Here we go. Alva.
Of prices, and so the predictability of these against the 4-hour averages, I just didn't think it was determined. I thought that was part of what you were getting at as well in terms of the uncertain effects of this on your DEB. But I think your explanation was better, so thanks.
I'm glad you think so. I'm a little bit worried that we've sufficiently confused stakeholders at this point, but maybe more questions will help. I see Callie Wells.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I'll admit, I was thinking along the same lines as maybe I'm confused at this point, because I agree with what Dawn was saying. I don't understand how option D, for example, if you define the reasonableness threshold based on, let's just throw out a number there, the highest maximum import bid price across that day, let's say it's $1,800. If that is now the reasonableness threshold for storage and hydro resources, when they go through that automated reference level adjustment process and they say, I want a DEB of, I'm going to say, they say 1,700, how that will ever end up lower than 1,000.
Oh, it wouldn't end up lower than 1,000. It would just end up lower than your DEB. So it's possible. But they just said but they just said I wanted a adjusted DEB of 1,700. How about this for an example? Say your hydro DEB as calculated, unadjusted, just your hydro DEB as calculated. And remember, in example A, that gives you the ability to just adjust your DEB up to the uncapped version. So an uncapped hydro DEB might get up to $1,500 on a day when the max import bid price is lower. So if that hydro resource went in to make a DEB adjustment, it's possible that it would get adjusted down below its efficient value as defined by the uncapped DEB.
Gotcha. Okay, so then can't you just define the reasonableness threshold as the higher of the two, and then we address that issue?
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I mean, just something to throw out there to consider. If because I think that still achieves the goal, and maybe the implementation isn't technology risk if it's simply just redefining what that reasonableness threshold is. Maybe, and I'm sure I'm not fully appreciating the complexity of the implementation side of this. To me, it seems to be just changing one calculation, and then all the other functionality still exists. And I know I oversimplified that, and if anyone on IT is on this call, I apologize. But yeah, just to consider.
We're going to go into the technology complexities in just a moment. Actually, why don't we continue, because there's some technology and policy implications that I think it's important to highlight before we get into approach one. So let's keep going. Great. So one of the first things that we had to think about is the max import bid price is an hourly value, but the reasonableness threshold is a single daily value. So what we had to do was modify the variation that you saw on your previous screen to the max value of the max import bid price for real time. We can't get a reasonableness threshold today that changes every hour. It's calculated once and it's calculated pre-market. The next thing we had to think about was when information is available. Remember that the referenceable change request process is something that the calculations need to be in pre-market, and then you can go in on an hourly basis to request an adjusted DEB through Cyber. If the highest cost verified bid for real time is not known pre-market, it's not something that we can integrate into that logic. We know the highest cost verified bids from the day ahead market, but we don't know what they're going to be in real time. We did try to investigate what this integration might look like in order to include these things into the reasonableness threshold, but it gets pretty complicated. I see a hand from Doug.
For the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group, you know, this reference to making changes in the day ahead market, it doesn't seem like there's any need. And the reason I say that is that the day ahead market looks at across the entire day. So it's already taking into account the opportunity cost for the use limited resources. So we don't need to monkey with that, at least for use limited resources. You know, the particular bids for any particular hour don't really matter. The market model is going to dispatch them in the day ahead in the highest value hours.
All right, I have failed at teeing this up properly. So the automated reference level change request process is something that you use in real time to make those hourly adjustments. So what we're talking about are modifications to facilitate DEB adjustments in real time. But in order to do that, in order to build that process, the inputs that we need come from day ahead, because we need to be able to calculate the DEB and the reasonableness threshold pre-real-time market in order to facilitate those real-time changes. So all of the references here to the day-ahead market refer to just the data that we're getting in order to inform real-time adjustments.
But aren't they, I mean, they're not known pre-market, day-ahead market, but they are known pre-market in real time.
Right, the day-ahead inputs that we use for real time are known pre-market. One of the challenges that I'm highlighting here is that some of this information to allow for DEB adjustments and reasonable thresholds, to allow for DEB adjustments in day ahead aren't known. So the storage option, for instance, is calculated by the IFM, which means there isn't an opportunity for storage to modify their reference levels, for example, through the manual reference level change request process prior to the day ahead market.
But I'm saying there's no need to do any of that anyway, because you don't have to bid above $1,000 to get the storage discharging to happen in the highest value hours in the day ahead market. You just have to have a price higher than your charging bid to get it charged in the lowest price hours and scheduled to charge in the lowest and to discharge in the highest. So we don't need to, there's no changes to day ahead. And as you could still take the results from the day ahead market to inform the real-time DEBs.
Yes. And so that's what this middle portion on your screen is. What we'd like to do is use the results from the day ahead market in order to inform real-time changes. But the reference level change request process currently does not get information from the IFM. So it doesn't have access to the market inputs today that we would need in order to facilitate those changes. We'd have to build a new pipeline for that data, which is a significant source of complexity.
I get it. So that's the technology risk aspect here. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Sorry.
No apologies. There's no dumb questions here. I realize that this is an unexpected crash course in both economics and system architecture. So feel free to jump in with all of your questions.
And that definitely triggered quite a few questions here. Sylvie, why don't we go ahead and go to Dawn? Callie, we'll go to you next, and then Michael will go to you.
So Sylvie, I think this is why if we go back and look at the two formulas that we proposed, we were not using any information that would recreate a new data feed from IFM to real time. That we completely agree would be an implementation showstopper because you've increased put it in new functionality. And I sure as hell would never put that in on August 1st. But what we were simply saying is it's an automated reference level adjustment that uses the same data that you're going to be calculating for everybody else. We just apply it to these two resources at that level. And if they submit a bid at 2,000, submit a bid at 1,700, and you've at 2,000, but you've calculated the value at 1,800, you bring their bid down to 1,800. If they submit a bid at 1,700, the bid stays at 1,700. It doesn't even go to 1,800. There's nothing that says you can't bid below the DEB. And so this is all about allowing storage to position themselves appropriately in the bid stack and in real time. And we just need to, the key thing is to position you correctly in the bid stack. It's not your information. It's not the storage DEB calculation that gets you the right part in the bid stack. It's what you're allowing others to bid. And that's why we triggered it to the maximum import bid price approach, because that's an approved and implemented approach.
So I think you're getting to a clarification that I was going to ask of stakeholders, which is in the issue paper and in stakeholder comments, it says the request is to modify the reasonableness threshold to the max of the max import bid price and the highest priced cost verified bid. Or do you want to cross that second part out and just focus on the max import bid price? Because as I'm showing you here, the integration to get that second piece, the highest cost verified bid, is not feasible for summer. But and that may be a moot point because there are other complexities in this that
I think
maintain
that would be,
the high risk factor anyway.
Well, that would be a better solution than approach one, where you keep the existing DEBs as is. So, I think that would be, to me, without talking with our membership, probably a more beneficial approach, because you've got both the DEB adjusted and the bid cap adjusted, and they're aligned in these high price conditions.
Look at us, market design on the fly. We can definitely make that correction, and we'll update what the stakeholder proposals say, or at least offer it to stakeholders to comment on. There are still a number of sources of risk here
Sylvie,
that we need to walk through.
But it may actually be a moot issue, because I think if you look at how they calculate the max, the resource specific non-RA or the resource specific non-resource specific RA offer cap and debt, it actually already takes into consideration the highest approved reference level adjustment, in addition to the calculated maximum import bid price.
That poses another complication in and of itself, and we will get there. And maybe I'm going to put a bow on this discussion to say that even if we make the modification that Don just conceded to, there are still a number of sources of risk with all of the proposals under Approach 3 that mean that they are still going to be considered infeasible. And we've got a couple more slides to get through on that. But I want to give other stakeholders a chance to jump in. Callie Wells.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. I actually wanted to go back to something Doug had mentioned in relation to applying this to day ahead as well. And I completely agree with him. Because the day ahead optimizes over the full 24 hours, it does a really good job making sure the storage resources are dispatched when they're needed most. But it comes down to a price formation issue. And without allowing the same bidding rules to apply in day ahead as it is in real time, you're going to, by design, be creating this systematic price difference between the two markets. And then obviously there's all the issues with virtuals and all the other stuff that comes into play there. So just wanted to throw that out there. It is a price formation issue. And also I think, making sure that all the resources that can bid above 1,000 have the same level playing field, because others can in the day ahead. So I don't see why we don't want to apply that to these as well. But I agree with him. I think the store, day ahead does look out over the 24 hours. So the schedules they get are pretty good in the day ahead, but it's a price formation and level playing field issue in our minds.
And I think this is reminding me of something that we thought about internally, where when it came down to prioritization, if there were extra complexities from applying to day ahead versus real time, instead of just real time, we prioritized real time in order to come up with this assessment.
Okay, and I appreciate that transparency. So this is more of a trade-off conversation and not kind of a market design issue. I think having that conversation today at some point would be useful, or at least kind of understanding kind of what those trade-offs are. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Callie.
Michael?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to Michael.
From PG&E. My question is on the middle bullet here. I can understand what you mean by saying, integration for kind of understanding the day ahead results and making that linkage. But when the cap is raised in the day ahead, but my understanding is that the cap could also be raised in real time without being raised in the day ahead. So is this integration required if we're just talking about real time and the cap hasn't been raised in day ahead?
So this integration doesn't necessarily have to do with the cap. Remember that the logic that applies to resource-specific resources isn't triggered. Resource-specific resources can bid above $1,000 anytime as long as the bid is cost verified. So the cost verification part is the trigger. And in order to cost verify the bid, we need certain information that we currently don't have the system capacity to verify.
Okay, but a thermal resource can be cost verified in the real-time market.
Yes.
And it can be manually cost verified or automated. And if it's manual, my understanding is the real-time hours would be hour ending 12 to 24, that window. And if it's automated, it could be 75 minutes before the market close and just for that applicable hour. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
So,
and the manual request has to be submitted by 8 a.m., I think, but applies to the applicable trade day as opposed to the hour.
Right. So my question really is, regarding this, would there be this integration if we just wanted to match storage to be able to match that what was done for a thermal in real time on the day in question?
It's integration just to come up with these calculations. It wouldn't change the process itself. We just need we need the system to know how to calculate the reasonableness thresholds. And today it has all the information it needs to come up with the variable cost DEB calculation. It doesn't have access to all the information it would need to calculate a reasonableness threshold for other types of resources.
But that reasonableness threshold, wouldn't it be just equivalent? I mean, storage isn't creating its own, it's just matching what is done for the highest cost verified.
Oh man, you really want to get into a discussion of system architecture, don't you? The reasonableness.
I just want to understand that this is.
No, I'm happy to get into it. Yeah, no, I'm happy to get into it briefly. There's more on this in the next couple of slides. And again, I want to emphasize that these technology constraints are not the only risks when it comes to this approach. And there's other policy risks that we see as potentially greater on this approach that we still need to talk about. But to get back to system architecture, there's a system called ECIC, and that calculates a lot of the DEBs. It calculates the hydro DEB, and it calculates the reasonableness threshold, or the variable cost DEB today. DEBs based on other things, for instance, the storage DEB is calculated by the IFM. negotiated DEBs, which is a lot of storage and hydro, are calculated by DMM. There are a lot of sources of information that feed into this. The reasonableness threshold calculation comes from the ECIC, and that's where all the gas and the hydro stuff is stored. So the reasonableness threshold today is not calculated in the system that calculates a lot of these other DEBs and has a lot of this other data.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that even if we didn't want to touch the DEB for storage, the way the system architecture is set up kind of requires that the implementation would involve this kind of day-ahead process.
It would involve more complex changes than meets the eye, I'll say that. I do think that I see Dan and Michael, or I see a few more hands. I do want to move on because we are not even on approach 1 yet, which is the one that we want to talk about for summer. So we have a couple more questions. I'd like to keep going.
Thanks.
And thanks for that time check. We're about halfway through. Michael, thank you very much. And again, we are trying to leave some. We've tried to make space on the back end of this to address any of those questions. So Dan, let's go to you really quickly. But then, yeah, as Sylvie says, I think we have a couple more slides. We get 3 more slides. We'll be able to kind of talk about all those risks as well, and then go into approach 1. So Dan, let's go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. Thanks, Sylvia. It's Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Be super quick. I forgot when I first stepped in just to say thank you to the CAISO for putting the effort into this. We're, critiquing something that already is a large sort of move in the right direction of recognizing the need and putting all the effort in. So I just couldn't go by without saying that. And then also very quickly, just want to support what Don was saying and note that issue of wanting to make sure that these resources are put into the stack in the right place is exactly what we're looking for from a Northwest Hydro perspective as well. Specifically in the real-time market, since we're dealing with this in EIM, that is the major concern, and I look forward to having kind of the longer-term discusussions on it. But the short term is just we may have to experiment with moving the guardrails a little further out and trusting in the competitive forces within the market and all of the transparency that's there that was not there maybe in years past when we developed some of the fears of risks of how people participate in markets. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for the opportunity.
Appreciate that, Dan. Sylvie, let's go ahead and move on, and let's get to approach 1, and then we can take some questions on that.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to speed through the next 2 slides. Not that they're not important, but mostly because I want to get to approach 1. There's a lot of information on this slide and the next slide about that can help inform some of the policy risks that we flagged as we were going through this. And I think the really high level takeaway here is that the reasonableness thresholds and the reference level change request process impacts the DEB. It allows resources to change their DEB from the way that it is calculated today. In any other situation, if we said, hey, we want to modify DEBs, it would be a significant policy process. Hydro DEBs took about a year to develop. Discussions around storage DEBs have been happening for years and years and years. So changing those DEB calculations using the reasonableness thresholds in an expedited policy process raised the flag as this is a high policy risk because it impacts market power mitigation and it impacts the intent of this process, which is supposed to be consistent with FERC Order 831. So we wanted to flag that for you as an addition to the technology complexity that we got into on the previous slide, as why this is too high a risk for August 1 implementation. I see a hand from Carrie Bentley.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. I have to say, I don't really understand that argument. It sounds like you're saying because other debates took long, you view this debate as taking long, but that's not really a rational argument in my mind. I don't understand what specifically about this DEB that you think will take a long time, especially because of all the very thoughtful work that's gone into this already by the stakeholders. And because we are pretty well aligned as a stakeholder community, I guess I'm unclear on where the CAISO is seeing the risk come in.
Measuring effort by timeline, I agree, is not a good indicator of risk or a lack of risk. It's definitely about the ability to have a robust discussion informed by analysis to come to a conclusion over what the right answer is. And what we're really going through right now is just a pure assessment of what we can get done by August 1st. So if we are able to get the entire stakeholder community around a robust discussion of how we might modify DEB calculations, then I'm all for it. It just doesn't seem like it's on the table for right now, but we welcome feedback on that.
Yeah, I would be really interested in if other stakeholders feel like there's been insufficient discussion around this, around the risk. I mean, we certainly appreciate the importance of default energy bids, but I do want to recognize that this has been one of the most articulate and thoughtful conversations from both the CAISO and stakeholders that we've had on really nuanced details. And I just want to make sure we're acknowledging that and that it is certainly a possibility in my mind and not a risky one to move forward. Thanks.
I appreciate that feedback. I'll note that stakeholder comments were expressed a degree of wariness around opening up discussions of DEB calculations as an interim approach. So I'm really reflecting that back in addition to the ISO's interpretation of risk. And again, I welcome feedback from the stakeholder community if we've gotten that wrong.
Yeah, it was my impression that stakeholders were expressing that concern for a longer term solution, but that everyone was on board with the compromises and the quickness of an interim solution. And so I think differentiating between the risks of the two are really important. And I think FERC typically acknowledges that interim solutions perhaps are not perfect, but that everyone has acknowledged and gotten on the same page that the trade-offs are worth it. So that's how I'm viewing kind of that risk assessment.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it with how we're going to transition to a discussion of approach one, where this approach has a number of different sources of risk. I know that we all want to open up discussions around improving DEBs. I've heard some really interesting ideas and stakeholder comments, including more dynamic DEBs, a forward-looking real-time market forecast that can help inform real-time opportunity costs for certain DEBs. And that's all going to be within the bucket of the continued discussion around how to make more robust enhancements here. But let's proceed to, I guess, slide 27 to wrap this up and start talking about those interim solutions that might not be the perfect outcome, but might be feasible for this summer. Or I guess maybe my numbers are a little bit different. Go forward. Keep going. There we go. So next steps. The ISO has asked us to commit to defining and articulating calculations for intraday opportunity costs such that we can build a process to validate and reflect those costs in the market. We very much look forward to continuing those discussions, but need to focus on what we want to do for summer. So let's continue to talk about that. Next slide. All right, under the umbrella of approach one are these modifications to the logic that applies caps to bids and DEBs. We heard stakeholders mention we could eliminate the $1,000 cap on DEBs, and then then you've offered these modifications to the bid capping logic, allowing resources with opportunity cost-based offers to bid up to $1,000, to bid up to the higher of the highest max import bid price or the highest cost verified offer over the entire day, which would represent a static value, or the higher of the max import bid price and cost verified offer as an hourly value. And this last option is the one that best reflects the logic that is currently applied to non-resource specific imports. Let's go to the next slide. So here I have put these in order in terms of quote unquote policy risk, or just how far these get us from today's policy. So today we put a cap on DEBs, and we have logic that applies to all bids. When you submit a bid into cyber, bids above $1,000 are capped by the higher of $1,000 and the DEB. And the DEB is also capped by $1,000. So you are effectively capped at $1,000. And that's today, so I put NA for technology risk. Option A is one step down. A slight or incremental modification from today would be to uncap the DEB, which means that your bid, if you submit a bid over $1,000 into cyber, that bid would be capped by the higher of $1,000 in the uncapped DEB, which means if you're a hydro resource and your DEB calculation is $1,500, you submit a bid into cyber of $2,000, it would revise that down to $1,500. The next step might be to add a modification to that bid cap logic. And again, this is the option that the ISO put in here as a potential alternative for stakeholders to consider against the max import bid price. In this case, if you submit a bid above $1,000, it would be capped by the higher of $1,000, your uncapped DEB, and the highest day-ahead marginal energy cost. So if that value is higher than your uncapped DEB, this option gives you a little bit of wiggle room. You would still be mitigated down, if mitigated, to your uncapped DEB. Option C is the logic that we've been talking about, using the higher of the max import bid price, or the highest cost verified bid for that hour. Option D uses the highest value of that logic. All right, let's keep going. Okay, this is, yes.
Sorry, we did get a hand up from Don. If we could go back a slide, and Don, let's go ahead and go to you. We have a little bit to go. Go ahead.
Yeah, Don from CISA again. You know, I don't see the need to differentiate between C or D. I think what we've always been saying is the non-resource specific RA price, whatever that is calculated, which will give us hourly granularity, that would get you to the right spot in the bid stack. And that's a number that's already calculated by the CAISO. So we wouldn't require any new data or new calculations. So, I think that's where, to me, that's where it comes down to. I think that's where everyone was pretty comfortable in terms of a consensus position that you should get the stuff to the right spot in the bid stack, which be the non-resource specific RA import price, which is calculated using very similar formulas that we showed for option 3. And then it just comes down to a question of whether you change the DEB to align with that number or not. So I think it's a very simple option.
Yeah, and I've noted here that the technology trade-off between either of those two options is pretty negligible. What you've noted is that it's something that we have going one way or another. It doesn't really impact the implementation part, but there is a significant difference when it comes to the market impact and the potential trade-offs that we want stakeholders to weigh in on. Alva.
Yeah, I think there's this tension. I think Don described sort of the one purpose just now, which I think is kind of what we're having in mind as well, which is this idea that you essentially with an economic signal can move a battery. Essentially, you're trying to move it out of the stack as much as possible. You're describing an unwillingness to discharge based on a later value to charge, but you're not quantifying necessarily that value really as strictly speaking an opportunity cost. It's a willingness based on your strategy for the day, essentially. The problem is that price can also, if it's taken, can set the price, and so we get into the dilemma, which I think I'm feeling between what Michelle has said and what I view as Don's very reasonable direction, which is if there's a lot of people who don't want to discharge or use their hydro early in the day, and then those people, you're going to have a bid stack which is made up of a very large number of resources that are bidding at that level, and the likelihood that prices will go to that level becomes much, much higher. So I think and then in between that, there's the whole question of, well, what you're really trying to do is express an opportunity cost, and you're trying to actually calculate what your opportunity cost is. But I think there's these differences in the purpose that make, and this is pointing toward the idea of, if you're going to option D, you're obviously treating this as a real opportunity cost, where you're basically saying, I want to bid at this level because I think it's going to be worth this amount later in the day, as opposed to just saying, in this particular hour, I want to be as unwilling as everyone else is to discharge. So I think I'm just throwing this out that these are issues that are really in tension with each other in my mind. So.
Thank you, Alva. I think once we get down to the analysis section, it'll be helpful to put some color to some of these objectives, and to hear stakeholder feedback on how the metrics that we're looking at on the screen measure up against what we're seeing throughout the day, but we'll get there. I see a hand from Doug.
Let's go to,
Doug Boccignone for BAMX. I agree with what Alva was just saying. In terms of option D, though, I think you'd want it to be the fourth highest priced hours for a 4-hour resource, right? Because otherwise it's not going to get dispatched in 4 hours. It'll only be dispatched for 1 on an expected basis anyway. And in terms of option C, if we're only taking the hourly bid prices and not the highest or the fourth highest price for the day, do you risk, I think you still risk getting the storage dispatched earlier than you want it to, because I think you had said earlier, in the early hours of the day, in the middle of the day, those maximum import bid prices could be relatively low. So are we really achieving what we want, which is to reposition the storage in the bid stack so they don't get dispatched too early?
Thank you, Doug. I saw similar feedback in some stakeholder comments in the last round as well. And I think we'll have to keep talking about this and take a look at what the max import bid price looks like over the course of the day to really put some empirics to this question.
And then I just sort of have a practical question. If this capped price for internal storage resources ends up being equal to the imports, and the imports are actually bidding at the capped price for them, wouldn't the internal resource, just because of internal constraints and effectiveness factors, wouldn't we end up dispatching the internal resources ahead of the imports and then also not achieve what we're trying to achieve?
Likely. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. There might be an interplay with constraints and penalty pricing there, but you might be onto something.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Doug. And again, we really appreciate this conversation. I see Sybil and Dan, so I want to get a little bit of that that Hydra perspective. Let's go to you two really quickly, and then we can move. We'll continue moving on. So Sybil, let's go ahead.
Thank you, GP. Just a clarifying question. Can you walk down these and clarify the granularity that each of these would apply on? Because it seems like some of these, if you're deferring back to the DEB and it's daily, then it becomes a daily cap. But then if you're referencing maximum import bid price, you have the potential to have a more granular calculation. Is that a proper interpretation of the stratification of some of these? And just could you just clarify, are all of these daily, or would some of these introduce an hourly granularity? Because I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, the let's see, option C would be at an hourly granularity. Option A is because you're capped by the uncapped DEB that's calculated once during the day. It might be a single value, but in the future, we can think about using the reference level change request process to allow that value to be more dynamic. The highest day ahead MEC is intended here to be a single value. We take that one value and we apply it to the cap. But turning these into hourly versus daily values is technically not super complicated. So we can talk about the trade-offs of either.
Okay, I think when we get into the examples, it would be helpful to keep that in mind, because I do think it potentially, if it incorporates some additional granularity, addresses some of these concerns about just too much of the stack just going to this super high price for across the entire day, and losing the important differentiation between offers. And then just wanted to reiterate something that Dawn said a few times. It's also important to recognize participants. There is competition theoretically in the market, and all of these still enable bidding below these prices. Thanks.
Yeah, yes. And I think, again, when we get down to the analysis, what I'll be interested in hearing from stakeholders is how do we characterize or interpret the space, if there is space, between these values that you see on the screen and the actual real-time prices that ended up materializing. I see Dan Williams.
Hi, Dan from the Energy Authority again. So just continuing on that last point of Sybil, and with respect to Alva, because I always enjoy his input on this. I do think that we have to be careful not to sort of make assumptions that just because there is a high DEB that will result in all entities sort of bidding at the highest level that's possible. There may be times when a few entities need to do that for specific operational reasons, but other than that, there's a significant tension in the profit motive to transact competitively in competitive markets. And for me, I'd prefer to see us start with as simple and implementable from this technology risk matrix here of looking at option A and seeing what may be required from there based on the extremely transparent market results that we'll have to observe. Because remembering here, when we're thinking about how hydro entities would be interacting with us, it would be specifically within the EIM. We're not talking about interchange import bids, hourly block import bids in HASP for this policy for these resources that we're looking at in the EIM. And unfortunately, I have to drop off for another call, so just wanted to make a quick comment on some of the analysis. It does make me uncomfortable to see some of the comparisons that are being made to the bilateral markets, just because the bilateral market prices are internalizing the effects of the the organized market prices, which include the three-part bid structure and include the expectations of the way that congestion will impact prices. We saw this very specifically in the cold snap in January, that there is a reflexive nature to them, but they're not comprehensive markets either. The data that we would be getting out of EIM and out of some of the bilateral markets is sort of splitting between the markets that entities are participating in as well. So I think there's others who can throw some grains of salt in there later, but I just wanted to thank the CAISO again for the time today and all the effort that's gone into this.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for pointing out that the hub prices are indeed complex. Will definitely be a significant highlight of this discussion.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the whole community there. So Sylvie, no other questions. Let's keep on forging ahead here.
All right, next slide. So this is something that I think stakeholders should be aware of, should understand, and will possibly impact the way that we formulate the proposals that we saw on the previous screen. So I want to make sure that everyone understands what's going on here. Today, specific resources can only bid above 1,000 if the bid has been verified through the reference level change request process. But the trigger to increase penalty prices and the trigger that says we have a cost verified bid is just a $1,000 bid, a clean bid above $1,000. But because the only way to do that today is through the reference level change request process, these things are triggered by cost verified bids through the reference level change request process. The proposals that we were looking at on the previous screen would allow resources to bid up to $1,000 without using, or to bid over $1,000 without using the reference level change request process. From a technology perspective, any of those bids are going to be considered cost verified, but we might not consider those cost verified from a policy perspective. And I want to make that distinction because it implies some regulatory risk, so we need to align on what we mean here. And I would like feedback from stakeholders over how we should integrate this into the logic from the previous slide. Let's go to the next slide.
So Michelle, we'll get to you right after this slide, if you don't mind. Just hold your hand for a second.
So if there's a bid above $1,000, we raise penalty prices, and that also triggers the logic allowing unspecified imports to bid up to the higher of the max import bid price or that new cost verified bid. Any bid above $1,000 resulting from proposals under approach 1 will be considered quote unquote cost verified by the technology, even if they aren't verified through the reference level change request process. So what this means is if we modify the bid cap logic to allow resources to bid up to the max import bid price or the highest cost verified bid, any bid that bids above $1,000 would then inform that cap. So I would like to get feedback from stakeholders if this is something that we want to be explicit about in these proposals or want to rethink.
All right. So any reaction or feedback on that? Let's go ahead and start with Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle, Energy Division from the CPUC. So just so I understand this, let's say we let people use the highest maximum import bid price at noon, or actually just throughout the day, and the highest maximum import bid price is applicable for just 1 hour. That means that that will be a cost verified bid, and that means that all the penalty prices basically for the entire day will go to 2,000. Am I understanding that right?
No, not your fault. I didn't explain it perfectly. So, and someone from technology can jump in if I'm wrong, but we raise the penalty price for an hour. So it only happens hourly. And just because the max import bid price,
But
just
even
because
if
the
you,
max import bid
No, go
price
ahead.
goes above $1,000, we would still need a clean bid to do the triggering. We still need someone to submit a bid into the market and for that to be accepted above $1,000. So there's a couple of conditions there.
Okay, so Hydro Resources has let's just assume the maximum import bid price equals the cap, and then let's say all hydro and all storage do that from all 24 hours, and so one of them has to get accepted, and once that happens, then non-resource adequacy resources that are bidding at the ties can also then bid up to 2,000, and one of them has to get accepted. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So just one more time. So for all 24 hours, they can now bid at the cap, assuming that you assume that choose the highest. Then that frees all the resources to bid above 1,000, right? And then they can be accepted by the market. Once the market accepts any one of those, like 1,001, all the penalty parameters for that hour go to 2,000.
Yes.
Okay, this seems like not a great idea from my perspective. And then I just want to go back to Order 831. The premise of Order 831 was that the cap was in, except for cost you could go above the cap of 1,000 for cost if you had a cost verified bid, right? So the fiction that we have here is that the bilateral indices are cost verified. I would note that we currently have litigation where some parties are arguing that that there is no cost verification and that they're subject to the Mobile Sierra doctrine. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what is happening in the bilateral market. I mean, we went into this assuming that there was cost justification for bilateral indices above 1,000, but that is uncertain at this point in time. So I feel like, I feel like the assumption is that the bilateral index is a cost justified bid. And so that calls into question what is happening in the bilateral market. So it just calls into all sorts of questions. So I will say that. Thank you.
Yeah, you bring up a bunch of good questions. I see Don Trethway's hand.
Hi, this is Don Trethway from CISA. I want to clarify for Michelle that CISA's position is not that you should set the, if you trigger in 1 hour a maximum bid price, that you would apply that for all 24 hours in the day and apply $2,000 penalty prices for 2,000 every day. It should be done hour by hour, and we're simply using the calculated maximum non-resource specific RA import value as a means for determining where that offer cap will be in a given hour. So you're not going to approve an offer cap of $2,000 at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I don't think anyone's really, like I said earlier, people have talked about theoretically you could make that argument if you wanted to, have a purist economic opportunity cost. And I think that's what Alva was pointing out with your option D on the previous slide. I don't think people are asking for option D. We're looking for option C. Come up with an hourly value. We position everything in the right spot in the bid stack. We address Michelle's concerns, and we can go fight it out whether it should be $2,000 24 hours a day later. But that isn't what we need to address the issues we're dealing with right now.
Thanks, Don. You mentioned a proposal to play around with the existing logic on triggering these penalty prices, and that is not something that is feasible for summer. That would be incredibly complex. So this is the logic for summer, and we need to make sure that our policy aligns with it.
Silly, my point is this isn't determined on a 24-hour basis. It's only if that's the determination, it should be done hourly if you chose option C on your previous slide. It's not done for a 24-hour period unless you choose option D.
I appreciate that perspective, and I wanted to I am representing all of the stakeholder proposals on that slide. So I appreciate your endorsement of C instead of D. I see Callie's hand.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I was going to provide the same clarification that Dawn did. I don't think we envisioned either that it would be raised to 2,000 for all 24 hours a day. It is an hourly determination, very similar to how, you know, the trigger is applied to those non-resource specific non-RA imports, right? They can't bid above 1,000 24, you know, every hour of the day when just 1 hour is increased. But in my mind, there is a slight distinction between C and D. D, in my mind, isn't raising the bid cap or raising the penalty prices to 2,000 for every hour of the day. It is still that hourly determination, but it's setting the hourly cap just slightly different. So instead of taking the maximum import bid price in that hour, it's setting the maximum import bid price at the highest maximum import bid price in, you know, across the day. So slight tweak, maybe that's a C, B, I don't know, but in my mind, that's where we had envisioned option D landing, not, okay, we're going to increase, you know, the penalty prices in the bid cap to 2,000 for every single hour of the day.
Thanks for that feedback, Kelly. You were right. I was trying to reflect your proposal.
All right. This one definitely has a lot of hands here. Oh, go ahead, Callie.
Oh, sorry, just one quick. So on the technology perspective, though, you guys have that trigger already somewhere in the systems because it's how you trigger for those non-resource specific non-RA imports. So just if you guys can maybe, I'm not asking you to respond right now just for sake of time, think about whether or not that same triggering approach can be applied here because it's somewhere built somewhere in your systems.
The issue is not whether that can be applied here. The issue is that a resource-specific bid triggers the penalty prices the way that you see on the screen.
Yeah, I was thinking more of just like the trigger that's used to allow those non-resource specific non-RA imports to bid up to 2,000, you know, the same that's applied to imports and demand. I think there's a trigger somewhere that isn't based on what you just mentioned, it's based on something else. I'm wondering if maybe there's a way to leverage that, but for sake of time,
yeah, I think
we can take that offline.
Yeah, we're conflating two different modifications here, but let's proceed. I see Michelle.
Yeah, sorry, this is Michelle. I'm confused because, I mean, we've been looking at the maximum import bid prices and you have it at the end of the appendices, but the maximum import bid prices, they're shaped. And so during the middle of the day, they're not high enough to hold your state of charge, right? They only go up during, you know, the net peak hours. And it's exactly, they're exactly wrong, right? So the maximum import bid price is too low during the day to hold your charge, and it's too high in the hours that you want them to discharge. So the only way to do it is take the maximum of the maximum import bid price, but then you're allowing $2,000 bids throughout the entire day, and it has those cascading effects that you just talked about. So I feel like I'm not really understanding Dawn's position here. So anyway, unless somebody has a clear explanation. So
thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I'm anxious to get down to the analysis now, but I want to get through a couple of more of these finer points so that we can get sufficient feedback from stakeholders on how we've designed and laid out the implementation of these approaches before looking at the analysis. JK or Dawn, did you want to respond quickly?
Yeah, so Michelle, I think the key thing is in those earlier hours, the storage resources are able to they're not capped at what their debts calculated for that hour. So they can actually bid up to $1,000 and put themselves at the top of the top end of the bid stack to prevent themselves from being discharged. So it's really the fact that the DEB and the bid cap are decoupled when your bid prices are less than 1,000, that storage can actually manage their state of charge. The problem is when you get into this 2,000 penalty price range, that goes away. And that's what we're trying to solve in the 2,000 range. Does that help?
Thanks, Don. Yeah. not seeing Michelle's hand, so let's go to JK and then Doug, and we can continue on. We're getting close to the technology considerations and policy considerations of approach one. So JK, floor is yours.
Hi, this is JK Wang from PG&E. Sylvia, I have a very quick clarification question. We're looking at the slides of the penalty price. Is this the penalty price that's usually on the demand side when we decide to curtail loads when the market runs into infeasibility, right?
I don't know. Let me see if I can phone a friend here and get you an answer.
Because I'm confused because when we talk about, I understand the two interact with each other, but when we talk about a storage bid cap is really on the supply side when we consider the storage supplies bid to discharge. But when you talk about a penalty price, I wonder, is the indication like the penalty price for storage to discharge during the hour, or what exactly we're thinking of the context? I want to clarify that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of questions built into there, and I think I'd like to more comprehensively answer that question offline. For the purposes of this discussion, what I'm really trying to highlight is that that a bid above 1,000 would trigger the ability of all of the resources for which we're modifying the logic to now bid higher because we've modified their ability to bid above $1,000. So instead of a cost verified bid using the reference level change request process triggering these conditions, it's any bid whose bid cap we've modified to allow to bid up to the max import bid price or $2,000. And that's really the point that I'm trying to express on these slides to make sure stakeholders understand the implications of embedding that logic into the bid cap logic 2 slides ago.
Okay, that's quite different information than we'll be talking about still at a bid cap for all the resources, but penalty price is a very different concept. So I want to get more clarity here. Yeah.
And you're getting at the far expanding implications of this beyond what's on this slide. So if you wouldn't mind submitting that into comments and we can keep talking about that.
Right, I just want to make sure that we understand that, that the term is used the same way we understand it. Thank you so much for the clarification.
Yeah, this gets very complicated, so I appreciate your pointing that out. Doug.
Yeah, Doug Boccignone from BAMX. I just want to reiterate my concern about the option C. I think it seems like there's a relatively significant risk that it's not going to achieve the desired objective of sort of holding back the storage until the later hours. And I think option D there's a risk that it'll hold it back too many hours. It won't get dispatched in the hours as you want it to. And I think we need to get more information to get more comfortable that we'd actually be positioning the resources properly to make it worth taking on the risk, the things that Michelle has raised in terms of these other changes to the DEBs and just to the allowable bids. I'm just, based on the conversation this morning, I'm thinking the approach 2 of the end of hour state of charge actually would achieve what you're trying to achieve. Yeah, you don't get the same price formation benefits, but you don't have all these risks.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. The first thing that you noted was that a lot of the values that we're looking at have the potential to either over or underestimate the costs that we think you all are looking to reflect. So there's some discussion around there that I will get to. But I appreciate those comments, and let's get to the analysis part so we can get stakeholder feedback on that. Let me go through 2 more slides on this approach, and then we can speed into the analysis section. one thing that we will need stakeholder feedback on is the second point on your screen. So the logic that caps bids today applies to all resource-specific bids. Cyber just does this to every resource-specific bid that comes through Cyber. So we had to think about how we want to target the solution at resources. We can use the master file, which is a relatively less risky solution than the last point on the screen, but the master file only allows us to identify resources by technology type. So the one that we finally, the implementation plan that we ended up going with was informing Cyber of which resources to apply the bid cap to by identifying resources that have opportunity cost-based DEBs. This adds a layer of complexity and adds risk to getting to August 1st implementation, but seems to do a decent job of narrowing the field. So I wanted to highlight that for stakeholders and make sure that you have the opportunity to weigh in on how narrow we want the solution to be given the technology trade-off. JR.
On at SRP, this might have been answered somewhere and I just missed it, but how do all of the approaches in general impact non-participating resources? Since default energy bids are calculated for non-participating resources and they are utilized to move non-participating resources or even participating resources that do not have bids on them in the case of specifically ABC events, but there are also some other events where they can be moved. How are they going to be applied to those resources in the same way as the participating? And then if that's the case, how would that work for the approaches that would allow you to adjust the bid? Since they are non-participating resources, they don't have bids on them. They just have the default energy bid.
I don't know. I'll follow up with you, but that's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, next slide. So this is just to summarize the policy implications, and I think this is something that Dawn was trying to get at earlier. Approach 1 does not modify DEB calculations beyond what they are calculated to be today. If subject to market power mitigation, these DEBs would reflect the costs as defined by today's policy. So this doesn't represent as significant a shift as modifying the reasonableness threshold would be. The second point that I want to make is that removing DEB, the $1,000 cap on all DEBs, would allow all resources, or would allow all non-gas resources to bid above $1,000 when their DEB is calculated to be above $1,000. This would not change the ultimate outcome for gas resources, for whom we are also eliminating the $1,000 cap, because most gas resources today have the ability to make DEB adjustments in the reference level change request process. Not only that, many gas resources have the ability to make DEB adjustments beyond what their DEB is calculated to be today. So there's no policy implication there. I also wanted to note the benefit of getting rid of the $1,000 cap on DEBs compared to all of the rest of these modifications is that it doesn't necessarily need to be unwound in order to support future enhancements and a more robust solution. Let's go to the next slide. So here is an overview, and this is the punchline. Here's the overview of the 3 proposals that we think are still in the running for implementation for August. But if this discussion has taught you anything today, is that there are a lot of risks and trade-offs that we still need to consider with the stakeholder community before committing to anything. Proposal number 1 is to remove the $1,000 cap on all DEBs. Proposal number 2 would add on to that. In addition to removing $1,000 cap on all DEBs, we would consider the highest value of the real-time max import bid price as part of that bid capping logic. The pro of this is that it was highly recommended and supported by a lot of stakeholders. As a con, we've been hearing concerns about the liquidity of bilateral indices and the accuracy of the shaping factors around the max import bid price calculation itself. And very soon we'll get into the analysis of this. The third option, which I put in gray because we didn't actually get any feedback on this through the last round of comments, but again, we offered this as an alternative to make sure we had an option in case there was too much feedback on the max import bid price, which is to modify the bidding logic to incorporate a different value like the highest day-ahead marginal energy cost, which is based on a more liquid market approach or market results, and has that hourly granularity instead of a shaping factor, which could represent an improvement in precision. It does represent a higher risk in terms of technology and implementation. So that's something that we want stakeholders to consider before moving forward. Next slide. This is how all of these things stack up in terms of the benchmark risk that we have attributed to them today. Remove the $1,000 cap on all depths was supported by stakeholders, but not as much as allowing resources to bid up to the max import bid price. In terms of policy risk, removing the $1,000 cap of all debts on all debts is relatively lower. Using the day-ahead MEC is medium. Using the max import bid price seems like a higher policy risk. In terms of technology, eliminating the $1,000 cap on debts is medium. Using the day-ahead MEC is actually the higher technology lift here than using the max import bid price in the bid cap logic. Finally, when it comes to regulatory risk, what are our chances going to FERC and getting this accepted? I say baseline here instead of low. It's really difficult to say if any of these are low risk going to FERC with, but the lowest of the three is removing the $1,000 cap on debts. The option using the day-ahead MEC we view as more conservative and therefore is a medium-high regulatory risk. And the third is high regulatory risk. Now, I said this at the beginning of the presentation, but these stakeholder conversations and the feedback that we're getting today and throughout this week through written comments is super important in order to help us address the policy and the regulatory risk that you see on the screen. So it's possible that we can reduce the amount of risk associated with these options as long as we get sufficient alignment and we're able to iron out those concerns from the stakeholder community.
A couple of hands here. Let's go to Don first, and then Callie, I see you as well. So Don, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Don Trethway from CISA. I'm wondering if CAISO's had any outreach to FERC already. I think when 831 was put in place, there was no contemplation about the amount of storage that was going to be on the system. In fact, there wasn't even a default energy bid for storage. And I think if you look at the intent of FERC Order 831, we're completely aligned with what the intent was. It's to the extent that someone's short-run marginal costs exceed the soft offer cap that you have to let them reflect that in their bids. And I would argue that the current capping of the DEB at $1,000, when you actually calculate the DEB should be $1,050 or $1,100, that's not consistent with FERC Order 831, that you didn't allow them to reflect their short-term marginal costs. And so I'm a little surprised that we don't have a better feel for if there really is any regulatory risk, because again, I think this is an interesting interaction that definitely was not intended by FERC with their 831 implementation. They did not put a policy out there that had the full intention of discharging use limited resources earlier in the day because of bidding limitations. So
yeah. Yeah, it is interesting and it is complex, and that's why we're open to talking about using a different route than the process that we built originally. That doesn't negate the fact that it is different and it is new, and we need to recognize the fact that it needs to be explained and supported for our federal regulators.
Thanks, Don. Let's go to oh, go ahead, Don.
Have you spoken with FERC and gotten any initial feedback?
I have not.
Okay.
Thanks, Don. Let's go ahead and go to Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I have a couple clarifying questions on this slide. So on your option 3, or I guess maybe under all these options where you say allow resources with opportunity cost-based devs to bid up to a certain value, kind of going back to the previous conversations, are you envisioning this to only allow that in hours where the penalty price has already been set to 2,000 or in all hours?
See, this is the question that I've tried to tee up on the previous page. What are we considering a cost verified bid? The technology considers any of these bids above 1,000 to be cost verified. So we have to have the discussion that you're asking right now.
Okay, I guess, so if I'm hearing you right, you haven't made that determination yet? Because I think the prior conversation kind of coalesced around, I don't think anyone envisioned this to allow bidding up to 2024, in all 24 hours of the day. I was just curious, when you guys wrote out these options, did you envision that, or did you envision from the technology perspective that it would only be in certain hours where something else has already triggered the penalty price or to be set at 2,000?
We cannot change the technology logic that's in there. So as soon as there's a bid above $1,000, those penalty prices are triggered. And we need stakeholders to take that into consideration if we want to modify or narrow the scope of these proposals.
Okay, I think I understand your response there, and I appreciate that. So another clarifying question on option 3, is this allow up to the maximum import bid price? Is this a variation of, I think, approach C or D? Is it the highest in that hour, or is it the highest across the day? Or is that also up for conversation?
I forget what we ended up doing the official assessment of, but I'm under the impression that the distinction between those two options isn't necessarily a huge technology change.
Okay. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, I think having it set to the highest value across the day really allows storage resources to be dispatched more efficiently, especially in real time when you don't have that full lookout horizon. Okay, I appreciate those clarifications. And just one reaction on, you said you didn't get much response on the option 2 or using the MEC. I think in our minds that actually might have quite a bit more regulatory risk than you guys have indicated in your table. And the reason I say that is because obviously, especially with storage resources, they're dispatched based on the price at their location relative to their bids, and congestion impacts that price. So even though the SMEC might be the same for all resources across the system, it might actually end up, if you set their bid cap based on the MEC and it's a resource that's, sitting behind a constrained transmission line and actually has a higher price, you might actually harm those resources by capping them at a lower value. So maybe that's why you didn't get much reaction to option 2, but I think given that, your regulatory risk is probably a lot higher than just medium to high. But that was just my initial reaction to that one.
A couple things to clarify on this. With the options on your screen, options 2 and 3, because these are modifications to the bidding cap logic and not the reasonableness threshold, it wouldn't affect the DEB. So if you are a storage resource and your DEB is higher than the day-ahead MEC, you can still bid up to your DEB. The bid cap isn't going to affect your ability to bid up to the max of your DEB. But we also thought through the exact issue that you just noted there, where the storage DEBs are nodal specific. So an improvement on the middle option here might be to use a nodal specific number, or perhaps to add a scalar to that to make it a little bit less conservative. But those are more discussions that we'd have to have.
Okay, yeah, I read this because it says allow them to bid up to the highest day-ahead MEC, which I'm assuming is SMEC, that is their bid cap. Even if their DEB was higher than that, the way this reads is it still would be limited to bidding up to the highest day-ahead MEC. So I appreciate that clarification, and maybe it's the higher of the two is what you're really trying to get at. But I won't belabor this. I just had clarifying questions on those.
No, those are good, and I probably should have labeled the slide with the current logic, which is resources are allowed to bid up to the higher of the soft offer cap, the DEB, and then options 2 and 3 here would include the highest day-ahead MEC or the max import bid price. So it's the higher of one of those options.
Okay, and just as a higher point, I really don't think we should be at a point where we have taken one of the variations of approach 3 off the table because of those policy risks. I really don't think those policy risks are there. I think everyone kind of agrees and has coalesced around we need to get something in place sooner rather than later. We understand it's an interim, solution, so it's not going to be perfect, but we're willing to live with something better than what we have today while those longer conversations can still take place. So I don't think we should have option or approach 3, one of those variations, off the table at this point.
I appreciate that feedback, and as you probably heard from the earlier discussion, there's a lot of complexity around that. So I'm happy to provide a venue for continuing to talk about that. And if it turns out that there's a ton of stakeholder aggregation around our ability to modify a DEB, then we can be open to that. But from our perspective, it seems very unlikely given the stakeholder feedback that we've gotten to date.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we're going to go to analysis now. If we go down a few slides, keep going, keep going, keep going. Go through the issue paper highlights. Yep, keep going. There we go. And can I make sure that Katie Wickler is here with me? Yep. Okay. So, we go to the next slide, and I'll introduce Katie Wickler, who's from our market analysis team, and she is responsible for the analysis that's in the appendix today. Katie, do you want me to facilitate this, or do you want to jump in?
Either way, I'm happy to give a little overview if you want to break from talking, and then I can jump into these slides.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. This is Katie Wickler with the market analysis team. I helped out here putting some metrics together on some of these price components that we've been talking about, just to sort of provide kind of an illustrative example or set of examples of how some of these proposals might have materialized based on historical days that we've seen. So a couple things I cover here at the higher level. There's some other slides that get a little more into the details of what I call a wider set of quote unquote 831 days. These are all of the days where we saw the bid caps raised to $2,000 due to the existing triggers. Here, I'm going to focus on just a couple days due to the time constraints, but if you're curious about those other longer set of days, that's in the slide deck as well. So the first thing I'm going to show are some price trends. So I'm comparing some of the proposed capping options that have been floated in the papers and in this discussion against an average real-time price. I'm taking an hourly average of the real-time, the 15-minute market SNEC for comparison. I'm also taking a counterfactual calculation of specifically the storage and hydro DEB subset, and I'm looking at those in a counterfactual manner to see what those prices would have risen to had the $1,000 cap not been in place. So if we hadn't had that $1,000 cap, where would those DEB calculations have landed? I'm also sort of using that for simplicity on the charts as a proxy for the highest cost verified bid. So there's some assumptions kind of folded in there. That's why you might only see one line for that. So I'll go through those, and then I'll show some bid price duration curves for a couple of these days in question. I thought they were useful to just sort of show the proportion of the resources that are bidding around this cap for those historic days and to what quantity. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so the first day I have covered here is September 6th, 2022. A couple of trends going on here. So in red, I have the average 15-minute market SNEC. That's an hourly average, as I mentioned. In yellow, I have the real-time maximum import bid price. So this is the quantity that we calculate specifically for the real-time market using settled bilateral index prices and an hourly shaping factor. I also have plotted the highest IFM SNEC times a multiplier of 1.1 or 110%, that's the blue line. And then in the green, you'll see this highest uncapped DEB. I haven't specified here whether that would have been a hydro or a storage DEB, but either of those two, that's the highest uncapped counterfactual calculation. So a couple things to point out here. In the peak hours, we did see the real-time max import bid price getting hitting that $2,000 mark for a few hours. The hourly profile of the max import bid price does somewhat track the real-time SMEC prices. Some of the peak hours, or I guess evening ramp hours going into the peak, you do see the max import bid price sort of undershooting the average SMEC just a little bit there, and then gets up above it for the peak hours. The DEB and the IFM SMEC parameters, you'll see those are plotted as static values. So, you know, as my understanding of the proposal goes, those would be sort of a static cap for the whole day, as opposed to something that's trended in a more hourly granularity. So for, you know, a good chunk of the day, those do come in higher than the real-time price that materialized, although you do see they are sort of undershooting those peak hour prices just a little bit. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I picked another day, August 16th, 2023. We did observe a heat event at that point, so I thought this might be a useful day to compare as well. So same chart that we're showing here. A bit of a similar story, with the one exception of a smaller subset of hours in the real time that did exceed at least exceeded $1,000 in the SMEC component. So whereas the previous price, we saw a larger block of hours exceeding that threshold, now the real time price is here a little bit more condensed to a smaller subset of hours. But sort of the same dynamics to point out here. The DEB and the SMEC, the IFM SMEC, are those static values. Those are lower than the peak hours, but higher than most of the other hours of the day. Real-time max import bid price as well is sort of capping out at the $2,000 mark for a few of the peak evening hours. And I'd like to go to the next slide. So a bit of a different comparison here. This is January 14th, 2024, a more recent day for comparison. And you'll note the price trends look a little bit different. I will note there's probably some influence of seasonality. So the previous two charts we're looking at are summer periods. This is for a winter period. Some interesting dynamics to point out. Now you're seeing that the highest price here on the chart is set by the highest uncapped DEB. That's most likely being driven by a high bilateral price that's being fed into that counterfactual DEB calculation. You do see the real-time max import bid price trending above $1,000 for a larger subset of hours and sort of reaching up to that max uncapped DEB price as set by a bilateral index price. But interestingly here, the real-time SMEC is trending lower than those two parameters, sort of in the ballpark of that static highest IFM SMEC parameter. So some different price separation to note here amongst the different parameters. I'll take a pause there and see. Yeah.
Katie, we have a couple of questions. One hand and one in the chat. Let's go to JR first.
Yeah, so my question is, have we considered in the previous example, and even in this one, you have the DEB and the IFM, I believe it was, as a straight horizontal line. Have we considered a somewhat generally shaped profile with an average of 2,000 or an average of 1,000? So the peak period essentially would have a higher threshold than if you were, for example, in a winter day. In the middle of the winter, you'd have two peak periods, right? One in the morning, one in the evening, and the trough would be much lower, but your average would be 2,000.
Do you want to take that one? It seems like that's more of a policy realm.
Yeah, so it's just kind of a question in regards to for example, the previous slides that you have, right? The one before this one, and the one before that one even. You have this very large peak in the super peak period, right? But you don't have pretty much any peak outside of the super peak period. So it would make sense that something that we are all looking for in order to kind of minimize risk on our side and also keep risk low on your side is something that would take into account that shape that tends to happen during that period. So we would want it so that the cap on the bid would be higher in the super peak period, and it could be lower in the off-peak periods, essentially. But to create a general rule, you would essentially use the historic to get the shape of the typical day in the month, for example, and then you would adjust the shape of the typical day to be the average of whatever for the 24-hour period. The average would be scaled up in order to fit the 2,000 threshold or the 1,000 threshold or whatever threshold we decide to use.
Yeah, I think I'm following along. It sounds like your comment is similar to others who have mentioned, we maybe only need these caps to be in effect during certain hours when we're trying to make sure these resources can be positioned.
Right, and I understand the complexity of calculating that hour by hour. So I do understand why you want to calculate it 24 hours in advance. But at the same time, using a straight horizontal line as if we don't know that there are off-peak and super peak periods is, in my view, not correct either. So I agree that hourly is too complicated, but shapeless is too formless, if you would.
All right, now I'm following along. Yes. In fact, we had a discussion about this a while back and ended up dropping it because we didn't have enough information from you guys. But one of the earlier things we thought about was, can we trigger the logic that's being described by stakeholders for only certain hours?
No,
we ended up not.
That. What I'm recommending is identifying the shape of the typical day in the target month, for example. Okay. Using the shape for the typical day in the target month, you then adjust that shape up or down by a scaling factor so that the average value of the 24-hour period is going to be equal to, say, $2,000 a megawatt hour. So now you've factored in that there is some shape to the typical day, and you get to do the calculation 24 hours in advance, and you don't have to calculate hour by hour. So it's kind of blending what we're looking for with what you're trying to look for at the same time.
All right, I think I'm following you. Would you mind putting that into comments for us to consider a little bit more?
Yeah, not a problem.
Perfect.
Thank you, JR.
Thank you
Nolan,
so
I see your hand, but let's go ahead and take Michael's, the question in the chat. So Katie, what is the horizon for the real-time maximum report bid price? How often is it calculated throughout a given day?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the real-time max import bid price is the 24-hour curve for the full trading day. That's calculated once the evening prior to the trading day. So, around 8 or 9 p.m., we receive the settled bilateral index prices that are folded into the calculation. So those have traded for next day, we receive those, we calculate against the shaping factor, and that is calculated and set the evening before the real-time trading day. Hopefully that answers that question.
All right, so Michael's hand went up. So Nolan, hold your hand. We'll get to you, but Michael, if you have kind of a follow-up or a clarifier, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the response. I guess I'm just trying to anticipate this situation where you have this information, you have the maximum import bid price the evening before, but if prices shoot up in real time, during the kind of middle of the day, and you have a cost verified bid from a thermal resource to raise the cap, you're basically, there's no mechanism for storage to meet that, to be able to raise its cap during the midday hours. If you can't use a match with the cost verified bid. that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I just bring it up as kind of seeing the gaps of some of these technology solutions.
I'd love to hear what other stakeholders think about that. Yeah.
Yep. No, thanks, Michael. Let's go ahead and let's go to Nolan. Nolan, please go ahead.
I think answering Michael's question, looking at like the January 14th event, we're dealing with static values from the day ahead. The current $1,000 cap that we have would not allow us to manage both storage or hydro effectively, looking at the overnight periods from hour ending, 16 through hour ending, 8 or 9, it's above $1,000. So you can try to protect your ability with bidding for those hours, but the market's still going to solve to have you at full output. The issue, I think, to JR's point earlier, having it shaped around the expected daily peaks where the prices are, is the volatility of real time, especially in price scarcity events. Having a flat value is essentially setting, in an imperfect way, the opportunity cost for those peak hours. Having, I think, cost verified bids and having the maximum import bid price is what the approach 3 was looking at. But I also think that, as Sylvie mentioned, is not something that can be implemented by the summer. So I do think a static value is the best solution that we will have for this summer. And we appreciate the analysis here.
Thank you, Nolan.
Thank you.
I think you highlighted, interim, and then again, we still want to discuss all this potential applicability to that more robust solution. So we have one more in the chat here, and then Katie, I know that you have a couple of other slices of data to present here. I just want to give us a quick time check. So when do SCs see the maximum import bid price for both IFM and RTM?
Yeah, thanks, Callie, for the question. So currently we don't publish the actual max import bid price quantity directly out on our external reporting systems. That was a decision we made due to data confidentiality concerns wrapped up in the use of those bilateral index prices. We do publish the hourly shaping factor that's used in that calculation. And in our BPMs, we sort of outline how you can take that value and apply it against the bilateral prices that you obtain on your side to get to that max import bid price value. That is in the bidding platform. It is a bit more apparent to those entities that are bidding and subject to that potential cap, for example, in RA import bidding. That would be a bit more apparent when you see those bids going through on your side. But generally, the underlying component of the max import bid price, which is that hourly shaping factor, that does get pushed out to the OASIS system by the time it's calculated, which I believe is the evening before the trading date for real time and the morning around 8 or 9 a.m. for the day ahead. There is a report out on OASIS as well that shows, I believe it's the real time bid ceiling. So that just shows whether the ceiling is at that $1,000 or $2,000 mark. So it doesn't show you the max import bid price at the granularity, but it does give you a sense, at least for the real time, of where that cap is sitting based on existing conditions and triggers.
Thanks, Callie. See your hand. Let's go ahead and unmute Callie for any kind of response or clarifier there.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Just to clarify, so I guess maybe not, they don't need to know specifically what the maximum import bid price is, but at what point in time do SCs see that bid cap has been raised? I'm assuming it's through cyber at some point. So it sounds like day ahead, it's by 8 o'clock in the morning in real time, they actually kind of know the night before.
Right. So keep in mind that there's two triggers to effectively set the cap as we have it currently. So if the cap is getting set by that max import bid price value, then yes, that is known between 8 and 9 a.m. for day ahead, and by, I would say, 8 or 9 p.m. the evening prior for the real time. The cap can get raised, though, by any sort of cost verified bid that comes in above $1,000. And so that could be a little bit more dynamic depending on when that bid is coming in prior to the close of the bidding window. But generally, your understanding is correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, Katie, no other questions in queue here. Let's forge ahead the next couple of slices here.
Sure, and maybe I'll pause to do a time check because I know we're close to the top of the hour. I can go through these next few slides quickly, but I'll defer to Sylvie if you'd like to take the time to pivot back to the discussion or wrap up.
I think this analysis is important, and we will definitely want stakeholder feedback on it. In an effort to respect those that need to drop off, I'll just note that this is highlighted anything today, is that these issues are complex and we need a lot of stakeholder feedback in order to inform next steps. So we'll put together a carefully worded comment template for you to make sure we have that feedback. And I would love it if, Katie, you wouldn't mind continuing to go through this for stakeholders that might have questions. Oh, and I'll plug that we have an MSC meeting tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go through these. I'll go through these expeditiously. So let's go to the next slide here. So turning away from price trends a little bit, I wanted to show a couple illustrative examples of a bid price duration curve, specifically on these days in question. And so what we're showing here on the x-axis is a cumulative megawatt quantity coming in from the bids, and then we're plotting that against the submitted bid price, or I guess actually the bid price that's internalized by the market on the y-axis. And so this breaks it out by different resource types. So first, we're taking a look at September 6th, 2022. I picked a representative peak hour, the hour ending 19. So, putting aside the quantity of virtual supply that we see above the cap, you see some portion of NGR, effectively storage resources, coming in to bid at that $1,000 cap. And if we move to the next slide, which is the same chart for real time, you see that quantity jump up a bit more, and then you also see in yellow that quantity of hydro bids coming in much closer to the cap for that higher end quantity. Next slide, please. This is the same story. This is just for August 16th, 2023, again for hour ending 19. You'll notice more NGR storage bids coming in at this upper bid price here, maxing out at $1,000. And then if we look at the comparison in real time on the next slide, you do see that quantity there, and now interspersed you have some additional hydro quantity kind of filtering in all the way up to the cap. And let me just get through the last two, and then we can go to questions. Next slide. This is the duration curve for January 14th, 2024, hour ending 19 and day ahead. Now we're seeing, sort of the similar stories I've just covered. We're seeing those storage bids come up, filtering up in at the $1,000 cap. And if we look at the corresponding picture in real time on the next slide, we're seeing that hydro interspersed in there as well, for a bit of a larger quantity than the NGR storage. So I just wanted to sort of show these to give a sense of, for those days that we're looking at, what are the quantities of those resources bidding up to that cap? Just sort of an illustrative example there. So that's pretty much what I have. I'll stop and see if there's a question, Juan.
Thanks, Katie. And yeah, Michelle, let's take your question here quickly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Yeah, just quickly. So just the bottom, I don't understand the 108, 112. That's just my quick question. My little more complicated question is, this is an hour in which we expect them to be discharging. Is that correct? I mean, these are the peak hours on these days. This isn't bidding at 1,000 to hold your charge. This is bidding at 1,000, right?
Yes, yes. And on your first point, apologies, I should have clarified. I truncated the x-axis to just show the upper end of the duration curve. So these are cumulative megawatt bid quantities at the upper end of the stack.
Yeah, I guess I just didn't understand. The day ahead had 52 to 54, which means that you're just looking at CAISO. Is this the market, the entire WEAM? Is that why the
Right, right. Yeah. So now you're filtering in more quantities of bids in the real time as opposed to day ahead, which is the CAISO.
4,000, and here we go. Okay, got it, got it. Okay, thank you. Helpful.
I'm sorry, Michelle, would you mind repeating that last part? Your audio kind of broke up a little bit. Could we unmute Michelle real quick?
Oh, I was just saying, I understand that, but I also, yeah, nothing else to add, just that, thanks for doing this. But I think it does mean that people bid at the cap. So to the time that we want them to discharge. And so if the cap increases to 2,000, will we get people sitting at the cap, even during stress system conditions when we want them to be discharging? Thanks.
No, thank you, Michelle. Okay, we are right up on time here. Katie, I'm not sure if you can take the question in chat really quickly, just whether these duration curves are cap bids or uncapped bids. But I do want to kind of give some quick next steps for the stakeholder group here. So Katie, can we address that one quickly?
Yeah, the subset that you see at the upper end above the $1,000 cap are those that do currently have logic to submit bids above the $1,000 cap when conditions arise. So, for example, RDRR, virtual bids, imports, under current rules, those do exceed the $1,000 cap under the certain conditions.
Got it. Thank you. So again, great conversation. Really appreciate everybody's active engagement, participation. I want to echo what I said earlier in that we really appreciate the robust nature of all of your comments, especially because we are asking for quick turnarounds here. Expect much of the same. Sylvia alluded to us having a carefully worded comment template to get that necessary feedback from you guys. We will be sending that out to you, and it will, forewarned, right? It will have quite a short turnaround again. So, Sylvie, is there anything you want to, kind of just say to wrap this up, put a bow on it, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. There's a slide at the end of the discussion, at the very end of or right before the appendix, that says recommendation for policy solution development. I think that's where we should end today. Before this, it might be in the 30s or the 40s.
Yeah, for the phased solution development. Yeah, our numbering is a little bit different. Try 40 or 34. I forget. We're three slides off. But if we could go kind of prior to Appendix A.
Great.
Yeah, it is.
Stop here. Oh,
yeah.
Nope. The next one. Nope. Go forward. 2. There we go. Stop. Great. So this is the thing that I will leave everyone with today. Given the policy and regulatory and technology risks that we've reviewed, we recommend the following phasing for solution development. For summer, we recommend focusing on the 3 proposals that I highlighted just before we started to look at the analysis, which is removing the $1,000 cap on the DEB and considering one of the types of bid cap logic, either incorporating the max import bid price or some sort of SMEC based on, or some sort of price based on the day ahead market. We're also going to continue discussions around the tools that we currently use as a backstop for liability, just to make sure that what's already in the market works for everyone and identify places for enhancements. Once we've ironed out what we can do for summer, we're going to put everything else in later buckets, but we're open to continuing discussions around those items, like enhancing the reference level change requests, considering solutions for PDR, looking at DEB modifications, reasonableness threshold modifications, and other ways to better capture those intraday opportunity costs. So for now, we'd really appreciate it if stakeholders would focus on those 3 proposals and help us iron out the details that might minimize risk or tell us what we should do next. And as Juan noted, we do have some specific asks, so we'll make sure to follow up with those via a comment template.
Thank you, Sylvie. And again, this conversation, or at least the topic rather, will continue in conversation tomorrow at the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. So we noticed that last Friday, so do tune in, and we appreciate everybody's time. We look forward to your comments, and again, we appreciate your very active engagement and quick turnarounds on this. We are trying to deal with this in a very expedited manner. So we appreciate the partnership and being able to do so. Brenda, I'll go ahead and toss this over to you.
Thank you, Juan and Sylvie and Katie and those who were able to help out contribute to today's call. Just a reminder, we do have the website. We have updated those slides that show a lot of the slides that were shown today. As well, we do have an energy blog in regards to the working groups, how they're playing a key role with policy development. So our vice presidents, Anna and Joanne, provide a working group blog, so feel free to check that out. It was just posted a few days ago. The next is we do have an upcoming new resource implementation meeting coming on May 1st, so a little bit coming close next week. So feel free, if you're planning to attend, register by end of day, April 26th, and also a virtual forum is available for you to just join us during that call. And then we do have the save the date for the stakeholder symposium by October 30th. So that will be held at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in Sacramento, California. We plan to send out registration and all information coming soon within the next few weeks. So very close. We'll make sure to update our stakeholder slides when that information is available for everyone. And if there's any questions, send them over to ourselves to symposium@kaiso.com. And we do not have a distribution list for this specific targeting symposium, so feel free to keep an eye out comes with notices in the ISO website. And lastly, we do have the new KAISO website coming soon for late May. We do have training sessions that will be scheduled on May 23rd from 9 to 10 and also May 29th from 10 to 11. Keep an eye out for the notices and details on social media. This new KAISO website has been planned for a while now, so we're excited to launch that this late May. So hopefully everyone sees a good opportunity to see a lot of new tools and hopefully ways to navigate through the ISO website. So that's something that we're excited about with the communications department at California ISO. But with that, I'll pass it back to Silas to end our call. Thanks, everyone.
With that, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. The call has now concluded, and you may disconnect.